Some girl asks a man of quite advanced age, who seems to be her father, if the present would have been different if she had not been born, and he replies that if she had not been born, if she had died back then, everything would have been different. The girl, with red short hair and green eyes, stands among the old ruins, looking at her father completely sad, and just not knowing what to answer him. If he even needs her to open her mouth, he hates her after all, so there was no point in answering him. Raising his sword, the man asks a question into the void. Could he, if the girl had died while still in labor, remain just a miserable man who lost both his wife and daughter at once, rather than going through all the misery that a daughter who killed her mother at birth brought into his life, causing him to never be able to love her? The raised sword trembles, and it is not clear why, because the man either feels sorry for the girl or he cannot kill her. After all, she is his daughter, or maybe he is just so weak that it is hard for him to hold a weapon. But even so, he dares to ask if the girl is satisfied with the fact that now they have both turned into monsters. The girl seemed even surprised by such a question, but her face showed no emotion at all. It was still completely blank and indifferent, both towards this situation and addressing her father. And the girl could only ask herself if she was content, but she didn't know the answer to the question. Straightening up and looking straight into her father's eyes with the same indifference, she only calmly said that she did not know what it meant to be satisfied with anything or anyone at all, and if that man was her father, he himself must know and understand it perfectly well. She recalls that she doesn't feel not only if she is content, but any feelings at all, remembering her life, like, for example, getting married to a man she had never seen before and never loved, nor did he love her, for that matter. Because of the fact that she and her husband never loved each other, all over the city soon spread rumors that he was cheating on his wife. But, again, the girl, and this also did not care much, because she still felt nothing for him, as well as the whole situation. But, in the end, she was suspected of killing her husband's mistress, accused of jealousy and everything else, even imprisoned in the dungeon. But she still did not care about the whole situation, and she still kept completely calm, knowing that she did not commit murder. And she, overcoming all odds, dealt with all the worries and problems on her own, just by herself, never relying on anyone else ever again. Even with the fact that she didn't feel anything, the girl was still sure that she had no reason to get punished for crimes she didn't commit. She just wanted to live and was willing to do a lot for her life. And for that reason, the girl just escaped from the dungeon. And for the reason that she wanted to survive, she also killed all of her pursuers. That so-and-so wanted to bring her home, that so-and-so just wanted to kill her. And because of all this, and because of the rumors that grew rapidly around her, everyone began to call her a terrible witch or rose killer. She was feared everywhere she went, as if she were evil itself, who had come to this land to punish people. Her father blames her for what has happened, saying that it's her own fault for everything that happens to her, that it's all payment for all the horrible sins she's committed, and suggests that she should, in the end, just end it all through battle. After examining her father, she only further confirms for herself that he is just a sick old man, a man who, with all his will, could not defeat her if she, with the same will, fought back against him, and therefore the battle was utterly pointless. But the man doesn't give up, clutching his sword tighter and starting to accelerate, saying that now only he and she are left here, and only they together can put a horse to all this mess that the girl who just wanted to live had managed to make. The man speeds up and jumps, bringing his sword high above his head, but the girl doesn't move, deciding to just end it all with her own death instead of fighting, thinking about whether memories create a person or a person creates memories, because she is completely confused about herself. The girl recalls her father's words, remembering that he called her a real monster, and all people called her a witch and a murderer. So does it mean that she is really a monster, a witch and a murderer who just doesn't care about anyone but herself? Not moving, just watching her father running at her, the girl thinks that she's just been terribly tired of everything all this time, even the life she's been trying to keep for so long, but apparently realized that it's just pointless. Looking at the face full of anger and disgust at the man flying at her, she even thought that it wouldn't be so bad to die at the hands of her own father, who hates her terribly much anyway, better than at the hands of a stranger. And it would be a fitting enough ending for her story, without all the extra stuff, without all the extra intrigue and the next mysteries. And finally, the usual feelings took over from insensibility, and so she died at the hands of the one who was supposed to protect her. And so, in the 548th year of the imperial calendar, the eyes of the girl, who had done nothing to save her life and to protect herself, closed once and for all. She remained forever lying in a pool of her blood and with her father's sword in her chest because he had no strength to pull it out of his own daughter, and he simply decided to leave her to die. At least the girl even hoped that her eyes had closed once and for all, but she thought that until she opened her eyes again and found herself in a soft bed in a luxurious room with long hair, constantly asking herself why she was still alive. Looking under the covers, she notices that the wounds left by the sword are gone, and she thinks about how her father, who seems to have killed her, would not have healed all her wounds and put her to bed, so that now she feels rested enough, as if the battle never happened, as if all those terrible years of trials and wandering and accusations and murders she never committed never happened. Getting out of bed, surprisingly without difficulty, she is not even chained to it. She walks around the room, which seems awfully familiar. Apparently it is her room, where she lived in her father's estate when she was a child, but it did not calm her down too much, but rather the opposite. She tries to understand what happened, realizes that she needs to calm down and think, but she can't. After walking a couple of laps around the room, she decided to take a look around, and because of that she stumbled upon the mirror, which she had successfully ignored before because she knew perfectly well that she didn't look very good after all her wanderings, but this mirror literally made her stand up and stop to see that everything was not as it should be, which threw her into a real culture shock. She stared at her reflection for 15 minutes, hardly realizing that she looked much younger, that her nightgown was different, that she was shorter in height, that her hair was shorter than it had been when she was a child, that there were no more abrasions on her face, as if all traces of her wanderings had been completely erased, as if it had never happened at all, as if it had just been a nightmare. Even if not paying attention to all the physical changes, even the very presence of this mirror is embarrassing, because this mirror in her room was broken when she was 17, and now, looking into it, she sees a kind of herself and kind of not, because the girl in the reflection is many times younger, even if it is an exact copy of her, but a child's, probably, 2 times younger than what she was at the time of her death. Suddenly there was a barely audible creak of a rather massive wooden door. It was carved with delicate, intricate patterns resembling branches and bright yellow gold trim around the edges. Someone had entered the room. Finally, slightly calmed down from her sudden hysterics, and realizing that she was not alone in the room, the red-haired girl looked around the familiar room, almost embarrassed. At the end of the room, near the door, stood a girl with brown hair. Her eyes were light blue and reddened with tears. She clasped both hands together in prayer. Finally, she spoke in a trembling voice. "Mistress, are you awake?" The red-haired girl stared in surprise at the one standing on the threshold. For a moment, she thought she couldn't breathe. This girl was my personal maid. Shocked, she thought. Betty? Barely audible, the girl exhaled. The girl still couldn't believe what was happening. She paced the room and shook her head like a madwoman, unable to understand how this could have happened. At times, she even barely audibly mumbled, calming herself down. No, it can't be. No, 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 no. You fell down the stairs. I was so frightened for you. The girl with brown hair was still trembling and crying, stepping closer to her mistress. What, wait, fell down the stairs? The girl interjected perplexedly. She did too, by the way. Without thinking long, the red-haired beauty decided to voice her thought. By the way, you have also become very young. Still not understanding what was going on, the girl tried to remain calm. Madam, what are you saying? After calming down a bit from her tears, the maid spoke again. You're joking in such a situation. She clenched her fists. It was obvious that she was really worried about her mistress. Betty, I'm not joking, the girl replied, leaning her thin hand tiredly against her forehead. She turned her amber-yellow eyes away, not wanting to meet her companion's tear-stained eyes. Yes, I'm sorry, but I wasn't kidding, she thought. Betty, how old are you now? Mistress asked. I'm 16. Looking at the girl perplexed, the maid answered her. She clutched the hem of her dress awkwardly, not understanding what she was getting at. But then how old am I? The girl with amber eyes looked at the maid incredulously. You turned 16 a few days ago. Madam, what's wrong with you? The brown-haired girl asked uncertainly, staring at the maid uncomprehendingly. I have one more question. What year is it? After asking him, she turned away from the maid to the window. It's the year 533 in the imperial calendar. Still not understanding what was going on, the blue-eyed girl answered her. So I've gone back in time? The thought came to the red-haired beauty's mind by itself. She told her that she had hit her head when she fell down the stairs, so she didn't remember anything. Madam, this way. Suddenly, a servant girl's high-pitched voice rang out from somewhere in front, forcing the girl to pay attention to her. I didn't think she would believe me. The red-haired girl continued to ponder, stepping closer to the maid. A recent event that happened about 10 minutes ago came to mind. Could you show me the house? Mistress addressed to the blue-eyed girl, who was already almost sparkling with happiness. Next is the young master's bedroom. The maid continued to tell the girl about the house, not forgetting to tell about these places and show them visually. How gullible. The red-haired girl thought for a moment. Madam, there's a gallery over there. The girl this time pointed her finger at a massive door without any patterns. It didn't stand out in any way except for a small, round window above the door. Would you like to come in? You used to go in there sometimes, the blue-eyed girl said with a friendly smile, turning for a moment to her red-haired companion, who was looking around the room without much interest. Really? The girl asked the maid a little incredulously. Of course. The still awkwardly smiling girl, who had already blushed a little, and her bangs fell a little on her relaxed eyebrows, exclaimed in response. The girl in response only looked at the maid with her amber-yellow eyes in confusion. I had completely forgotten that I used to go there often before I left my parents' house, she thought sadly as she looked around the room. Maybe I just wanted to look at her. Olivia Chloe? She remembered a portrait of her that seemed to have been erased from her memory long ago. The canvas had been painted of a beautiful girl with snow-white hair and eyebrows. She had crystal-clear white skin and green eyes. Probably just wanted to see my mother, pondered the red-haired girl peering at the gallery door. She didn't have the strength to go in or out. A strange feeling settled in her chest as if pressed. Really, but I can't feel emotions. The red-haired girl was thinking about her own long-dead mother and not understanding her attitude towards her. Mistress. The uncertain voice of a servant girl sounded above her head, disrupting her from her train of thought. This is Mr. Leston. The girl continued her speech. This time, the girl did not risk pointing her finger at the object under study. The guy was dressed in a black and white suit with gold inserts on the cuffs and collar and yellow epaulettes. He stepped closer to the two girls. What are you doing here? He asked arrogantly, turning to Ray. I killed him. That was the first thought on the girl's mind. In time, it had become habitual to the point of gritting her teeth. But when she came to her senses, she realized she was confused, and now she had no idea how to answer him, so she said the first thing that came to mind. I just wanted to look at my mother's portrait. The man frowned and nodded faintly, but he remained silent. The atmosphere had changed since he had come. It had become older and more oppressive. Basically, nothing had changed since his past life, thought the girl. The blue-eyed guy with blue hair abruptly turned around and walked away in the opposite direction of the two girls standing next to him, only dropping a cold phrase in his voice. Go away. You better not get caught by your father after all. I was so excited when I saw Mr. Leston, the maid said fearfully as the man walked out of sight. Roe only thought emotionlessly in response. That's right, he's always disliked me, hasn't he? Leston Chloe, he's also the one who pointed the sword at me, and my only brother. In my memories, he'll always be like that, cold-blooded, sword in hand, ready to kill me easily. Roe pondered. A little boy came to mind, pointing his finger at her, saying, You're not my sister. You killed my mother. Over time, the silhouette faded, but the words stuck in her mind forever, at first echoing phrases without end, but then turning into mere phrases that made no sense. There was such a thing. The red-haired beauty thought sadly, looking away, not wanting to see him off. She was still standing at the closed door of the gallery, but now all thoughts of her mother were taken up by her older brother. I wonder if he too had come to see his mother's portrait. Could such a cold man also miss those who had died? Finally, opening the massive door, she took a leisurely step into the room. Outside the window, it was deep night. The large panes of glass reflected the moonlight that fell mesmerizingly on the trees that surrounded the patterned, whitewashed manor and the small, scarlet shutters above the windows. All day long I thought, why did this happen to me? Why do I have to live it over again? There are so many people in the world who wish they could turn back time because they regret their past. But I have never wished for something like this, thought the girl, wandering aimlessly around the room. Will I really have to live this life again? The red-haired girl could not come to terms with this thought, although all the options for the upcoming events led to the same conclusion, although not the best. Boring, thought the lady, turning her bright amber-yellow gaze aside. Her red hair glinted off the moonlight. Finishing her own musings and resigning herself to her own fate, she sat down on the bed. How boring and unpleasant it all is. Sadly, she thought, and that was her last thought before falling into a short sleep. That's what I thought until the next day when I had a new problem. Betty held out a red, stamped envelope to the girl. The red-haired girl examined it incredulously, and only then took the letter in her hands. The girl didn't often get letters, so she was visibly perplexed. After looking at the envelope a few more times, the girl raised her voice to the maid and asked her what it was. Only then did she slowly open the envelope so as not to tear its contents. The maid replied that it was an invitation. The girl's voice sounded quite happy and calm at the same time. Usually she didn't show all the invitations to the mistress and just accepted them for her, but this letter was an exception. Hearing this response, the red-haired girl said that she had already realized that. Silence hung in the room for a few moments. Betty moved the basin of water for washing closer to her mistress and said that she sometimes attended social events, though not often because there was no mistress in the family of the Marquis Chloe. The girl reread the contents of the envelope once more and noticed Count Richard's signature in the corner of the letter. If so, the maid's words about the absence of a mistress were true, and she and Leston distributed social events among themselves. The girl sat on a chair waiting to wash. She was completely immersed in her thoughts and memories of the future from which she had come. She had only recently found herself in the past, and now she didn't want to go out, but it was her duty. The maid scratched her chin and thoughtfully asked the girl to listen to what she was about to say. It was evident from her eyes that Betty didn't really want to talk. The red-haired girl turned her head toward the maid, leaving her thoughts and returning to reality. But what was her surprise when, instead of explaining, she saw the maid leaving her room with a very quick step, saying no, nothing. After this incident, Betty continued to behave strangely. She stopped looking her mistress in the eyes, looking away. The girl closed in herself, it is unclear why, but their relationship, which was very even not bad, abruptly went downhill. Another oddity was the eyes the maid used to look at the red-haired girl. When she ate, Betty's face showed pity, but the girl could not understand why the maid felt such emotions at the sight of her. Tension hung between the girls. Around them accumulated only bad emotions. The atmosphere became too sad and continued to heat up more and more. This continued around the clock. Wherever the red-haired girl went, the maid always followed her tail with glassy, tear-stained eyes. And one day, the mistress had had enough. On one of these walks through the corridors of the manor, the girl couldn't stand it and called out to the maid who had been following her all this time. Betty twitched with surprise and turned her head sharply. But the girl had anticipated her action and stood directly in front of her. Then the maid looked away. Her mistress asked her firmly and decisively if the maid was hiding something. She mumbled something to herself, unwilling to answer. Noticing how scared the maid was, the girl softened her gaze and voice a bit and told her to speak, as she would not be angry no matter what. The red-haired girl's eyes looked honest enough. Betty looked away again, not daring to look into her mistress's eyes. The girl put her hands out in front of her and began to quickly say that now mistress's memory was not normal, maybe she should rest for a while. The girl just as quickly replied that she would only be able to rest when she listened to everything. So the maid continued. She reminded her that after the girl's 15th birthday, the Marquis had held her engagement ceremony. When the red-haired girl heard those words, the first thought that popped into her head was, it was that time. She hadn't thought about it until recently. She hadn't really cared much about the engagement. Betty's gaze faded when she said that she did not see how an engagement could be arranged without personal acquaintance. After all, the girl was the eldest daughter of the Marquis, not some little thing. The maid also added that the man to whom she was engaged was named Keynes Roderick. He was the son of Earl Roderick. Though the question of betrothal had not troubled the girl before, now, looking at Betty's distraught face, she realized that the trouble had been accumulating for years and had brought her to this end. Kenneth Roderick was the man to whom the girl had been engaged at 15 and married at 18. Now, seemingly long-forgotten images of the man began to surface in her mind. She had never even seen him before the wedding. Now, rethinking everything, it seemed to her that if she had voiced her displeasure about the engagement, or at least befriended Keynes, perhaps something would have changed. And it wasn't too late to make a change now. The girl looked away, thinking one last time that it was all for the best. Now she had every chance to change her life. After that, she got out of the chaos of her memories and looked at Betty again. The red-haired woman tried to sound as cheerful as possible and said that many people nowadays were getting married for convenience. She also added that Betty had better get her ready for the ball. Ideally, she would have liked the maid to bring her a knife, but that request was unspoken. With those words, the girl literally shoved the maid out of the room. As she shoved her out of the room, the red-haired girl was mentally proud of herself. Her hair shimmered in the light, all shades of red, and the slight draft made it move. Then she racked her brain in an attempt to remember something important. She remembered exactly that this room, in her parents' house, was where she had hidden her journal. The bookshelf above the desk, fifth from the right. The phrase surfaced in her memories, and the girl immediately reached her hand to the designated spot. She'd been 14 when she'd stashed her diary there. The diary wasn't a big deal, but it was wrapped in the same cover as all the other books on the shelf. Unless one looked for it intentionally, it was indistinguishable from the other manuscripts. The girl flipped through the pages, which had not yet yellowed and retained their whiteness. There were only a few pages in this little book. Compared to her past life, she couldn't remember the last time she had seen this diary so clean. She put her hand palm to the page and mentally recited some mantra about blood of magical origin and the method of applying the blood recording. It seemed to be some kind of magical technique or spell. The girl had started writing this journal when she first learned how to control magic. She was overwhelmed by nostalgia. The red-haired girl stood without moving and gazed at each neatly lettered symbol on the pages. She then picked up a silver knife from the table and ran the blade across the index finger of her right hand. This journal entry did indeed require her blood. She thought since she had gone back in time, there could be abnormalities. It had to be checked urgently. The girl ran her bloody finger over the line written in this diary and whispered quietly, "Now his name." Before the blood dried, they should have given the diary a name, but the girl had run out of ideas for one. She froze in a slight stupor, trying to think of some kind of name. The girl looked around a few times, but didn't come across anything suitable. Then she started digging through her memories, hoping to pull something out of there. But the first thing she remembered was the cold voice of some man she knew well from her past life. He looked at the girl with a blank stare, monotonously ordering her to go to her room. It made goosebumps run down the girl's skin. She froze in a stupor. This was one thing, but this was a man she clearly didn't want to remember. Still, it wasn't a bad idea for a new name for the diary. If he remembered her now, it must have been a sign from above. The girl quietly said one single word: ice. After that, red-blue flames erupted around her, and a strange glow emanated from the pages of the diary and her palm. Apparently, it had worked. Ice wasn't such a bad name after all. The diary, as if magically enveloped in blue flame, slammed shut. It was only at that moment that a realization came to the red-haired girl. She'd really done it. She never thought she would retain her former power after being reborn. She was luckier than expected. The girl ran her hand over the cover of the journal. A sharp chill hit her fingers. She had completely forgotten that she could change the properties of an object with this spell, so she was surprised at how icy the cover was. Rose magic could change the properties of objects. The girl finished with this spell and reached out to the shelf again. Tepper, she needed to put the journal back. She carefully pulled apart the spines of the other books on the shelf and placed the diary between them. It was more accurate to say that the girl's magic partially endowed the item with some sort of specialty. She couldn't turn a butterfly into a kite with this simple spell, but she could make the book burn her hands cold. After reading the spell, when the item was already endowed with the desired properties, the girl was surprised every time. But this spell technique was not perfect. Like everything in this world, it had its flaws. The effect couldn't last long. Firstly, because the spell used almost no magical power, and secondly, the properties of an object simply could not remain unchanged. For example, a book that was freezing your fingers after lying on the shelf would become normal temperature again. Putting the book back on the shelf and making sure that its cover was no longer as cold as ice, the girl turned around and slowly walked away. She relaxed, thinking that no oddities would be noticed now. Everything was fine. The next morning, the maid came to the girl's room as usual to apply some makeup to her face. She brought with her a basket of shadows, lipstick, blush, and various soft brushes for applying cosmetics. The girl carefully, with light strokes, passed a cotton sponge over the girl's cheeks, making her look pretty. The blush left a tinge of healthy pink blush on her fair skin. The cosmetics made the already beautiful young lady even more beautiful. The room was quiet. The maid was focused on her mistress's makeup, and the red-haired one was just staring ahead. Suddenly, the hovering silence and peacefulness was shattered by 3 crisp knocks on the door. Betty turned her head, asking the girl who it could be. Without being invited to enter, the girl's brother came into the room. Betty froze in bewilderment and called out to him. The young man froze on the threshold, quickly mumbling something under his breath. Then he said loudly that he was sorry. His sister appeared before him, ready to go to the ball to which she had recently received an invitation. Pink ribbons were woven into her hair, tied into neat bows. The girl's makeup looked beautiful and matched her eye color. When she noticed her brother looking at her, she looked down, not wanting to meet his gaze. She already realized that it wouldn't lead to anything good. She was wearing a light white dress also decorated with pink bows. After a few seconds, she still looked at her brother and asked him if there was anything unforeseen. She genuinely didn't understand why he had shown up at her now. The young man with blue hair stepped closer to her. They were now standing a meter apart. He said he had heard that Count Richard had sent her an invitation. The girl interrupted him, asking him what he meant. The young man replied that he had personal reasons for being there, so he wanted the girl to give him the invitation. The girl would have been glad to get rid of the invitation, but here was the problem. She was already packed. The red-haired girl mentally reprimanded herself and then asked, "What are those reasons?" Her brother answered her that he couldn't tell her what those reasons were. The girl accepted that and said anyway, she wouldn't want to give him the invitation. The maid, who had been standing quietly aside all this time, turned to the young gentleman, asking them to listen to her. They fell silent and ceased to quarrel about the invitation. Then Betty went on. She said they could go there together as they were brother and sister. At that moment, the realization came to both of them that the maid was right. That same evening, the Earl's estate was lively and noisy. Carriages and wagons kept pulling up to the main gate, and gentlemen were coming out of them, each one more handsome than the last. It was as if the Count had organized a fashion show at his estate, not a ball. Once there, the brother and sister immediately went their separate ways. As the young man walked through the ballroom door, the girl thought she should greet the Count as well. She was starting to get bored with all of this. After greeting everyone, the girl, who was walking behind her brother, looked forward and stopped to think about what to do next. She didn't plan on being here for the entire ball, so the red-haired girl firmly decided that it was time to get out of the hall. The girl went out the other doors that led to the garden. There, on the veranda, were many aristocrats of different classes. They were drinking and making merry, sharing the latest gossip. But she was not interested in such things. The girl thought maybe she should take a walk. Thinking that was a great idea, the red-haired girl walked forward at a leisurely pace, moving away from the noisy crowd. The path she was following was surrounded by majestic trees. The wind rustled lightly in their leaves and swayed their branches. It seemed that nothing could destroy this beautiful atmosphere. The girl walked with half-closed eyelids, enjoying the warmth of the evening, but suddenly out of the blue she opened her eyelids sharply. It seemed to her that something terrible was about to happen. The red-haired girl found herself by a lake. It didn't seem particularly deep compared to the other lakes she had seen. After opening it, everything was a little blurry in her eyes, and her gaze was still unfocused, so she didn't notice anything strange at first glance. Then the girl shifted her gaze from the water surface to the shore of the lake. There, behind a lush green bush, the silhouettes of two people were clearly visible. A girl with ashy long hair was standing on the shore, admiring the lake, while someone else was sneaking up on her from behind. The person approaching her from behind was a short-haired girl about her age. She sharply extended both arms forward and pushed the girl into the lake with all her might. She didn't even have time to react. The water surface broke in waves from the collision of the girl's body with the water. Because of the surprise, the poor girl didn't even have time to get enough air in her lungs, so she didn't even try to get out, but went straight to the bottom. The red-haired mistress, who was watching the whole show from behind the bushes, marveled at how cruel this world was. She groaned quietly and couldn't take her eyes off those two. The girl thought she had to help that drowning poor girl. It seemed like she had just witnessed a murder. There was an upside to that, but many people had seen her go out into the garden, so she could very well become a suspect. With that realization, she moved quickly towards the water. Standing on the bank at the water's edge so that the strong waves reached the girl's shoes, she opened her mouth, exposing her sharp, fang-like teeth. She didn't want to fall under suspicion, so now she was going to do everything she could to save that girl. Her decision was quick and quite deliberate. The red-haired woman brought the index finger of her left hand to her teeth and bit down on the pad of her finger. Her teeth were so sharp that they easily pierced the skin. Blood rushed from the wound. Then the girl crouched down with her legs tucked in her knees and touched her bleeding finger to the water. She quietly said part of the spell. It sounded almost the same as that ritual of naming the diary, only now she was naming the water with air. The source of the magic was her blood. That, too, was indicated in the spell. Droplets of blood slowly dripped into the clear and cold water of this lake, instantly coloring it burgundy red. The red-haired woman was already used to it, so using this spell no longer disgusted her. When the water was sufficiently colored red, the girl continued. She quietly cast a spell that changed the property of the item. This spell could be used whenever and wherever, but its only downside was this very bloodthirstiness. Swirls of magical energy swirled around the girl, who was dressed in a white dress with pink bows. She thought about the fact that she had only recently traveled back in time, and she would hate to be called a murderer already. Miss Rowe jumped into the water and gradually began to descend deeper to find the girl who had just been thrown down in front of her. It was difficult to navigate the water, but Rowe tried her best because she didn't want to become a murderer in the eyes of witnesses. After a little more searching, Rowe Chloe still found the drowning stranger whose body was already so deep that her rescuer even upset about it. But Rowe Chloe realized that she had no way out, and looking at how the girl's body with every second let go lower and lower to the bottom of the dark blue pond, swam after, stretching her arm forward. That would be faster to grab the girl and finally pull her out. Soon Miss Chloe was beside the drowning girl. She took her under her arm and asked if she was all right now. But when there was no answer from the stranger, it came to Rowe that the girl had lost consciousness, and so was now unconscious. Miss Chloe had no choice but to drag the body upstairs to bring the drowned woman to her senses. Rowe wasn't really going to save her. She could easily kill her, but she could just as easily save her. It wasn't a problem for her. The strength to lift the heavy mistress, a 15-year-old girl, was not enough, but she realized that she needed to get up a little more, so she decided to act through strength, because she realized that there was only a little bit left, and throwing everything like this is not profitable. Rowe already began to see the light at the beginning of the water. It meant only one thing. Soon she will swim to the street. There are still a couple of jerks. But then suddenly the girl began to feel a sharp decline in strength. Miss Chloe realized that it is magic, which she used in the beginning to jump into the voodoo, ceases to act, the girl, even a little panic, because she realized that if someone now it does not help her, the whole rescue can be abruptly cut off. In fact, it was true, and such an outcome could be expected because now Rowe was in the past, and then her magic was completely different. Now she was trying her best to pull the girl out, but everything around her was getting in the way. Even her dress was getting tangled. It was getting worse and worse. Rowe didn't feel her strength at all. It seemed to her that she was going to drown, but she didn't want it to be the end and a complete failure in her rescue attempt. Rose slowly began to accept her defeat right at the finish line, as suddenly, out of the water, a man's hand suddenly appeared, which took the fragile wrist of the girl and dragged her out of the water right into the street. Rose was pulled out of the water so sharply that she gulped too much air into her mouth. The girl, with her mouth open, tried to see her savior. She was wondering who could appear at such an opportune moment. The body of the drowning lady, who had already been rescued, was taken away to bring her to her senses. Miss Rowe herself sat down to catch her breath, and the gentleman who had helped in the rescue squatted down beside her. The gentleman who was sitting beside her asked if Miss Chloe was all right, and she replied that she was all right, and that she was relieved at last, for she no longer needed to drag someone with her last strength. At these words the stranger smiled. His smile was mysterious and light. Gradually Rose began to look at her savior. She could already see that he had yellow hair and his skin had a pale color. Looking a little higher, Chloe saw a young man with greenish-yellow eyes and a light strand of hair that covered one of his eyes. The guy said that Rose had saved Cecilia, a name that didn't mean much to the girl, but she liked the fact that she was able to save her. Rose looked directly at the guy who was sitting next to her. She asked who Miss Cecilia was. Her companion looked friendly enough, so he calmly said that was the name of the girl who had just been rescued. Chloe, this name seemed very familiar, she asked again. Cecilia, about whom the young man had just spoken, does not happen to have the surname Richard. The guy confirmed her guesses, and then the girl remembered everything. Cecilia Richard, the same one who in a few years would marry Leston, Rose's brother. It seems that they had married for love, which was very unusual, because at that time, married, usually by agreement of the parents, no more. Miss Chloe and the guy who saved her continued to chat. Leston walked by them as if nothing had happened, and what was his surprise when he noticed a silhouette that looked like his sister. The boy even turned back to make sure he hadn't imagined it, but even when he realized that he was seeing Rose in front of him, even though she was wet, he couldn't quite believe his eyes. Rose herself was surprised to see her brother. She was even scared when she met his gaze. It was a revelation to her that Leston could have more than just a rough expression on his face. The boy stood looking at his sister. He quietly called out to her. The girl looked at her brother indifferently. She really didn't know how to react to his behavior, because it was the first time he behaved like that with her. She couldn't understand why he called out to her. All she had to do was to look at him calmly. A guy who was sitting next to Rose was watching the situation from the side. He was a little surprised that the girl was familiar with Leston. He was curious to know how she had such connections. The young man, friendly, with a nice smile, asked how his new acquaintance knew Mr. Leston. She replied that the guy was her own brother, in fact. It was a little hard to believe because those were not similar. So from such a fact, the blonde-haired boy even thought about it. His reaction was that he did not expect such an answer from Chloe. In a moment, the young man realized that he looked very strange now, so he needed to change the subject somehow. Sir quickly got out of the situation. He quickly changed his expression to a brighter face, again put on a nice smile, and reminded that during the entire dialogue, he did not even ask about the girl's name. The stranger stepped closer to the girl and, leaning slightly, asked her what her name was. The lady called herself Chloe, and the boy replied that he was very pleased to meet Miss Rose, and now his interlocutor was waiting to hear his name in return. The young man called himself Arthur Robert. Rose looked at him again. Arthur's appearance resembled that of a golden retriever, or the sun, which was about to go below the horizon and let the moon show itself. Looking at him, Miss Chloe realized that the guy seemed familiar to her, as if she had seen him somewhere. The girl asked if her new acquaintance was a magician, because in her head there was only one guess, and with this question she wanted to confirm it. Mr. Robert did not give a direct answer to this question. He told the girl to wait a bit, and after a while he began to twist bright green beams with his hands, thus demonstrating his power. Watching this, Rose remembered everything. She remembered who Arthur Robert was and why he seemed so familiar to her. The thing was that he was a famous magician, only in a completely different sense, namely a good one. Because unlike Miss Chloe, whom everyone knew as a horrible witch who received only hatred from the whole world, Arthur was famous for being the best magician, having fame and recognition from all his admirers. His reputation was so pure and bright that Rose had never heard any negative gossip about him that could tarnish his name, which was probably why the guy was always so positive. and as if he radiated light around him. Such contrast surprised the girl. How different are the mages, although in fact all were similar something, all equally used magic and had a powerful force. It all depended on what reputation they had among people. Such were the thoughts that went through the girl's head. And while she was monologuing in her head, Mr. Robert, with the help of his bright lettuce-colored rays, helped his new acquaintance to dry faster after jumping into the water. Ro didn't even realize what had happened at first. Then, when she saw that her dress was dry, and that by the expression on Arthur's face, he had obviously had something to do with it, thanked him for his help, and said that she had heard of him before. Then she turned around and started to leave, saying that she had to go, and now it would be better for the boy to help Lady Cecilia to dry his clothes. This sounded so sudden from the girl's lips that the boy did not even begin to stop her at once. But Ro did not really listen to him. Miss Chloe was ready to leave, so she slowly began to move away from the guy standing next to her, but suddenly she heard someone running towards them, and looking closer, the girl realized that it was Miss Cecilia, who, apparently, had just recently woken up. The girl came closer and introduced herself as Cecilia Richard. Then she thanked Ro for saving her, explaining that she would have died a little more, and then promised that next time she would formally invite her savior to the manor. Miss Richard came even closer to Chloe. She took her hands, and looking directly into her eyes, thanked her once again, calling her a brave girl. Such a gesture confused Ro. She didn't think the gratitude would go that far. Holding Miss Cecilia's hands, Ro thought about what to say in such cases and how she should behave. It was the first time she had ever done such a thing. She would have said something in response, but she was afraid that her words would be taken the wrong way or they wouldn't fit the situation at all. When Ro looked away, she saw that right behind Miss Richard stood her brother Leston, who also did not understand what was going on. Apparently, not being able to show emotion in sensual situations was a family thing. Still, it seemed a little wrong for Miss Chloe not to respond to the words of gratitude, so she chose the best option, timidly say something light in response. After all, showing affection wasn't such a bad feeling after all. Soon, everyone was back home and the day was beginning to wind down. The maid was helping Roja into bed and covering her with a blanket. She said that the mistress had had a hard time today and she definitely needed to rest. The maid was about to leave the room when suddenly there was a knock at the door of the room. The girls inside were puzzled. The maid asked who could have come to see Miss Chloe at this hour. She said she didn't know. Miss Chloe went to the door to open it. The girl's frail hand pulled the large red handle of the door when suddenly she was called by the maid, who said that the girl should not open the door in such a way. But the red-haired lady did not care. She did not take the words of the maid as something important and opened the door. She was very surprised to see who decided to come to her, and therefore immediately asked what happened. The thing is, on the other side of the door stood her brother Leston. He put his hand on his forehead and a little hesitantly apologized for such a late visit. He explained that the reason why he was here was because he wanted to thank his sister. This made the girl even more surprised. She stood there with her eyes wide open, for she didn't understand why she should be hearing words of gratitude right now. Ro questioned why Leston was so grateful to her. The boy was a little taller than his sister, so during this dialogue, always looking down, he explained that he was grateful to her for saving Miss Cecilia, because not everyone would have been able to dive into the water so bravely. But even that explanation didn't help Ro understand why her brother was standing there now, at this late hour, saying thank you to her. She said she didn't understand why he was thanking her, but all she got in response was that he was doing it for nothing. Ro took her brother aside, for as far as she could remember, at this time her brother was not yet romantically involved with Miss Cecilia, and so such gratitude was very strange, and from her brother, for if anyone should be thanking her, it was Cecilia herself. Miss Chloe, after a little thought, began to ask Leston leading questions, such as whether he was engaged to Cecilia, or whether they were officially dating, or whether he had confessed his feelings to her, but the answer was no. In short, for the time being, there was unrequited love between them. And Mr. Leston had nothing to thank his sister for. When the boy finally realized this, he covered his face with his hand again, and now asked his sister to accept his sincere apology. The boy said it all the same uncertainly, with a note of guilt in his voice. But such words puzzled the lady again, only this time even more. She continued to stand and look at her brother with her own surprised eyes. After a few seconds, Roe asked why he suddenly decided to apologize. This time Leston already said more confidently that he was on his way to see Miss Cecilia that time, and that's why he couldn't give his sister the attention she deserved. And it seemed to him that he had done wrong in neglecting her and running off after another lady. These words to Miss Chloe were already more understandable. She told her brother that everything was fine and he could not worry about it. Leston was surprised at such a reaction from his sister. He asked why his behavior didn't hurt her at all. And the thing was that Roe didn't know what a real family was at all. She had only heard about it in general terms. Wasn't it important in a real family to have heart-to-heart communication and fond memories of each other, as others said? Between her brother and her father was not a bad relationship. The Marquis was always proud of his son and heir, as is usually the case in traditional families. However, between Roe and her father, there was a different relationship, so the girl realized that the Marquis and Leston could be considered family. Roe explained to her brother that apart from blood kinship, they had nothing to do with each other. They rarely saw each other, and not even once did they have a heart-to-heart talk. So she didn't have any positive emotions, rather the opposite. To put it simply, were Roe and Leston family at all? The girl said these words dryly and without emotion. She even turned her head away so that she could not fully see her brother's reaction. Even though the words were honest, it was very unpleasant to hear them. After these words, Roe left the doorway and went into the depths of the room, and Leston remained where he stood in the process of dialogue. He was dumbfounded by the words of the girl, and did not quite understand how to respond to it. Soon Miss Chloe came up and closed the door right in front of her brother's nose. She did not feel that she had done anything very strange or unpleasant to him. Turning her head slightly, she saw her maid looking at her the whole time. Roe asked if everything was all right, but in reply she only saw that the maid's eyes were watering from her words, whether they affected her because they were too true or because she felt sorry for Mr. Leston, who had to listen to all this. It was a new day, the sun was shining, Mrs. Roe was already awake, and beginning to prepare for the coming day, when suddenly a servant came running up to her, saying that Miss Chloe had received an invitation from Count Richard's estate. Roe was indifferent to the invitation. She asked the maid if she must go there, for she was very reluctant. But in reply she heard the maid say that it was the first time anyone had invited Miss Chloe for personal reasons, and if she went, it would be a great chance to make friends. Such a reason did not particularly interest the maid, and she indifferently put the sheet with the invitation aside and said that she was not particularly interested in the subject of friends, for she did not particularly need new acquaintances. But the maid did not want to listen to her mistress's opinion. She said that everyone needed friends, especially her, and she took out the various tools for making up and got ready to help Roe to get ready for her first reception, where she was the only guest. Miss Roe tried again to stop her personal maid. She repeated that she did not care for this visit. In response, the maid said that Mrs. Chloe should not talk like that because the girl needed to expand her social circle. In an instant, the maid began to tidy up her mistress, doing her hair, makeup, and curling her eyelashes. She was serious about making Roe look beautiful at the reception. Mistress herself was thinking about why she was doing all this, all these introductions and new friendships. The clear sky stretched over the castle, the sound of wheels and the clatter of hooves reached the depths of the forest. In the distance could be seen a castle with a blue roof. It was built of white stone. A white carriage, pulled by horses with dark coloring, approached the gate passing the forest path. The carriage doors opened and out stepped Lady Roe. She had green cat-like eyes. Her red hair was gathered into a ponytail and tied with a brown ribbon. She was wearing a white shirt with a brown cape over it and a bouffant skirt to match the color of the cape. The attendant waiting outside the door greeted her, and the lady said hello to her. The maid escorted Lady Roe into the garden to the tea place. There was a beautiful large fountain in the garden, and next to it was a table with 4 chairs set with various sweets. The maid asked her to wait for a while until the lady arrived. She quietly agreed as she looked around the garden and its furnishings. Suddenly, Roe's eyes were drawn to the sweets on a 3-tiered rack that stood on a patterned white table. They glittered so much on the table that they were begging to be taken at least one piece. Ro contemplated taking one piece after all. After a short wait, the hostess of the party showed up. She was wearing a light dress in pastel blue colors. Cecilia came in the company of two gentlemen. One was blonde, and the other looked like Cecilia. They had extraordinary silver hair. She greeted the guest cheerfully. The blonde-haired Arthur, whom Ro had become acquainted with due to recent events, spoke to her, saying that they had not seen each other since the day Miss Cecilia had fallen into the water. Ro greeted him in turn. Cecilia's loose hair lay softly on her bare collarbones. Pressing her hand to her chest, Miss Cecilia thanked Lady Ro sincerely for her visit. She said she would like to properly introduce herself to her and gave her last name and first name, adding that it was a pleasure to meet her. Ro decided to introduce herself in return by also giving her last name and first name to the guys and girl watching her. Cecilia told Ro to just call her by her first name, to which Ro agreed and suggested the same. Having finished introducing herself to the party hostess, the guy behind Cecilia waited his turn and said he was happy to meet Ro. Cecilia extended her hand towards him and told the lady that there was one more person left to introduce to her. Cecilia introduced her twin brother. He was tall, well-built. His eyes were silver, as was his hair. Noel, in turn, gave his last name and first name. He put his hand behind the back of his head. It was obvious that he was a little embarrassed. He was wearing the clothes of knights. Cecilia hit her brother sharply in the stomach, but he still finished his speech, saying that Ro could address him by name. Cecilia apologized for her brother's rudeness. She whispered angrily, told her brother that he was even ruder than her. Arthur watched this picture with a big smile on his face. He was used to such clashes and quarrels. Ro didn't understand what was going on. She didn't know what the relationship between brother and sister should be. Ro looked at them with a perplexed but at the same time studying look, wondering if the relationship between family members was the same as the maid Betty had explained to her. The tea party began, and as they poured hot tea into cups in the garden, the pleasant aroma of the brew spread. They began to talk to each other, and Ro was asked how old she was. She said she was 15, to which Arthur said in surprise that they were 3 years apart. Arthur raised his hand and said that they were all 18 years old and had been friends since childhood, to which Cecilia timidly intervened and corrected him and said that, to be more precise, she and her brother had to make time for Arthur and play with him when they were children because he seemed unfriendly. Noel told Arthur that he used to be unfriendly and it was hard for them to interact with him in any way, to which he was indignant. There was a friendly aura around them. It was warm and so tangible. They were having fun, and it was as if they didn't need anyone else. Ro opened her mouth and stared at them with her green eyes. She started to think about something else, the concept of friends. She had never had any, in this life or the last. She was alone everywhere. And now she had a chance to understand who they were, how they interacted with each other, what bound them together. As if on purpose, the friendly party had bypassed her, and she hadn't felt the warmth and fun of such a party. Taking her eyes away and finishing her tea, she had come to the decision that her friends were nothing special. Finishing her tea, Ro put the cup back on the saucer. The empty cup meant Ro would be leaving soon. She didn't want to make small talk at the table. She wanted to find out the reason why she had been called. Ro turned to Cecilia, and she called back. Eager to leave the party, Ro looked straight into Cecilia's eyes and asked her if she had invited her because she wanted to ask her something, citing the recent event at the royal ball where Cecilia had been pushed into the lake, and Ro had unwittingly witnessed it. Cecilia realized that Ro had understood and sadly said that Ro had guessed the reason why she had been called. Without going around and around, Cecilia asked her if she had seen who was the one who had tricked her into going into the lake. Ro thoughtfully put her hand to her chin and began to remember that day at the royal ball, and said that it was dark and she couldn't really see a face. She could only remember that the girl had red or brown hair and was wearing a dress that could be described as any guest who had attended the ball, so Ro doubted the usefulness of her own words. She remembered the situation that had happened the night before. Before her eyes, some girl with the same build as Cecilia had silently crept up behind the lady and pushed her into the lake, and then, before anyone saw her or suspected her, quickly ran away. Ro realized that her words would be of little help and said that too many people could fit that description, and the boys agreed, for the gentlemen with red and brown hair at the royal ball could not be counted, and it was a waste of time to look for them. Suddenly, Ro wondered how Cecilia had gotten there. She asked why she was there. She said that someone had given her a note that had been bent several times, and when she read it, she thought that Noel or Arthur had called her there. Concerned for her friend, Arthur suggested to Cecilia that she entrust the matter to the head of the Richard family, her father, but she replied that she did not want to make a big deal of it and distract her parents from important matters and cause them trouble. Moreover, she might run away if the elders interfered. Knowing her friend well, who makes dangerous decisions for herself, Arthur asked Cecilia if she was thinking of becoming a decoy and said it was dangerous, to which Cecilia said she had him and Noel by her side, especially since everyone who knew about her being pushed here. Ro was wary, though she didn't show it, but she wanted to find out why she had been called and leave. The fact that she had no friends had affected her, and she liked to be alone most of the time. She asked herself the reason why she was among them. She looked at the people around the table and wondered. Ro was looking at Cecilia very carefully, and she reasoned that she was seeing her for the second time. She frowned her eyebrows. There was a strange feeling of wariness or anger building up in her. She couldn't understand, but she knew one thing. She needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Ro stood up, which attracted the attention of the people at the table and stopped their dialogue. She said that since she had told everything she knew, there was no reason to stay there and she had to go home. Not wanting to listen to their arguments about the further course of action, she started to go home. Realizing that they had forgotten about their fourth guest, Cecilia started to apologize to Ro because she wanted to get to know her better. But they started talking about their own things. She admitted that it wasn't her who had invited her, that it was Arthur's decision. Turning to Ro, who had already pulled her chair to the table, Arthur gave her a pitying look and said that apart from the problem with the criminal, he just wanted to see her. Ro couldn't believe it. She asked in surprise if he meant her. The blonde blazed with happiness. He had finally managed to get Ro's attention. Smiling broadly, he replied that he really wanted to see her because he was interested in her as a person. After the events at the royal ball, Ro often appeared in Arthur's thoughts, and finally he invited her to the tea party. Ro frowned her eyebrows and asked why he was interested in her as a person. She had never received so much attention even in her family, and Ro saw Arthur's curiosity as something dangerous, so she kept her eyes on him. As if to clarify his intentions, Arthur looked directly into her eyes and asked Ro a rhetorical question about whether she was a magician. Her brother and sister Richard looked at Ro, waiting for an answer. Arthur started to tell Ro that she was smaller than Cecilia, but when she was drowning, Ro was able to pull her out of the water when she was unconscious, and in a wet dress, Cecilia was even heavier. He brought the conversation to the fact that Ro could use magic. Ro furrowed her red eyebrows and asked Arthur menacingly if he thought she had used magic to help the drowning Cecilia, to which he just smiled without saying a word. Looking pitifully at Ro, Arthur remembered how after the girl surfaced, Ro's brother ran not to his sister, but to the other victim. Arthur said that, to be honest, even after noticing how Leston ran to Cecilia first that day, Ro was too calm. Cecilia asked what Leston had to do with it, to which Arthur said that at that moment he left his sister and rushed to her. It was strange because they were not so close. Cecilia did not even notice it. Ro realized from her reaction that her brother would have to make a lot of effort. Ro was already furious. She asked Arthur what was so special about her brother's behavior. He in turn avoided answering. He said that Ro didn't seem to be fully aware of the characteristics of mages. Arthur glowered at the fact that he could now explain to her everything about mages. Noel, intervening in the conversation, said in surprise that mages were respected by the aristocrats because they were very rare, and he didn't understand why Ro chose to keep silent and hide her abilities. Ro replied that she knew a little bit about magicians. She said mentally that she only knew how to use magic, but she didn't say it out loud because they hadn't seen her use magic yet, so she had a chance to change their minds. Cecilia said that magicians were rare and special people, that they were the center of attention. She asked if Ro had noticed them discussing Arthur before Cecilia was pushed, to which Ro replied that she wasn't interested. Just as Cecilia thought, Ro wasn't interested in the royal ball. She said just as she thought Ro wasn't interested because she too was a mage. Warily, Ro asked how it was all connected. She was already suspicious of everyone at the table. Interfering in the conversation between Cecilia and Ro, Arthur wanted to start a story about something related to mages, but his eyes were caught by a stirring in the far corner of the garden, and distracted by it, he did not finish his speech. The one who caught Arthur's eye was a maid. She was standing at the exit looking for her mistress. It was obvious how worried she was, and Arthur asked Ro if she was the maid she had come with. Ro replied that she must have been waiting for her for a long time, and so she had to go. Everyone got up from the table to see Ro off. Cecilia clasped her hands to her chest and said it was a pity Ro was leaving so early. She said they would be happy to see Ro at any time. She offered to see her off, to which Ro politely declined. Suddenly, despite Ro's refusal, Arthur rushed after her and said he would follow her. Noel only had time to shout at him why Arthur was doing that. He wondered why Arthur had suddenly taken off like a stung man. Arthur turned around and said that Ro was a mage, and a young one at that. She didn't know the basics that other mages had been taught since childhood. Arthur also said that it was a mage's duty to help another mage, so he should make friends with her. It was their duty. One of the guests from the tea party was approaching Ro and the maid. It was Arthur. He was running and waving his hand, trying to get her attention. He shouted to Ro to wait, adding that he was escorting her. The maid Betty asked Ro who this gentleman was that was following her lady. Ro replied that it was Arthur Robert. The maid flinched. She told Ro that he was the heir to Duke Robert. Ro, not noticing Arthur trying to get her attention, asked if Betty knew of him, to which Betty replied that he was very well known for being a capable mage despite his young age, as well as being a noble, handsome man. Ignoring Arthur as if it was the order of the day, Ro got into the carriage and told Betty to get on her way. Arthur was shocked at the indifference to his person. He began to think how he could attract her attention and finally make friends with her. Arthur shouted to wait for the lady and said that he wanted to tell her something, and it was exactly what she wanted to know. Interested in his words, Ro, getting off the carriage, told Betty to wait for her a little in the carriage. Still, Arthur managed to attract her attention. Getting away from the carriage and the unwanted ears, Ro told Arthur that he could now speak. Arthur said that if he knew who the mages were, Ro could also identify them at a glance, to which she became interested and asked how to do it. Arthur started to ask if it was possible that Ro felt that she was different from others. Giving an example, he said that she couldn't understand others, to which a hostile Ro crossed her arms and replied that right now that was what was happening. Arthur began to clarify, for example, Ro couldn't impeach other people when someone was angry or crying, and Ro might not care about that, or she might not understand why others might hate or be angry, to which Ro replied that she seemed to have always been like that. Glowering and smiling, Arthur said that this is the peculiarity of mages, that in return for their immense power they are deprived of emotions. However, with age, one can learn to show feelings. To put it simply, humanity is an acquired skill for them, and therefore Ro needs to learn to show them too. Ro, holding the elbow of his other hand, timidly asked if Arthur was the same, to which he replied in the affirmative that he only at the age of 12 began to understand emotions little by little. He said that those who haven't quite learned to feel yet are called youths among mages, such as Ro. Arthur said that usually a more experienced person is assigned to those who have not yet learned to show emotions, and he becomes their teacher and helps them to learn their feelings, to understand what they are. He said that Ro also needs a teacher, to which she replied that Arthur is wrong and she does not need anyone. Ro thanked Arthur for explaining who the mages were, but said that she was fine with it. On the contrary, if she had the ability to feel, she wouldn't be able to hold on as firmly as she did, knowing that she was rejected by everyone. Surprised to hear Ro say that, he opened his eyes wide. Arthur couldn't even imagine what Ro had gone through to start feeling that way. He could only say her name, though he really wanted to support her. Smiling warmly and sweetly, Arthur offered her another option. If she didn't want to study with the teacher, they could just be friends and share what was on their hearts. Ro asked Arthur in surprise, why would she become friends with him? In her entire 2 lives, no one had ever offered her friendship. Not even she herself had sought them out, knowing that she would be rejected anyway. Arthur thought about how to answer Roja. He asked himself why Roja would want to be friends with him, and began to explain who friends were, saying that they were people with whom one could share feelings and experiences, that neither were always welcome. Smiling, he explained warmly and understandingly that Ro could feel different emotions and it could help her cope with life's difficulties. A light breeze lifted leaves into the air, swirling them around in space. A special aura may have built up between the two of them. It was already a different day. Outside the window, the weather was indeed lovely. The sun was shining high in the sky, illuminating a whitewashed palace with a red brick roof. A girl was sitting in one of the rooms, and the chirping, enthusiastic voice of a maid sounded above her. "Madam, you have a letter again." "Madam, you." "Have you made friends at last?" the blue-eyed girl asked in an excited voice, clutching a letter with a burgundy sealing wax and a turquoise seal. Her light brown curls were tangled in the envelope, and the rest of her hair was tied tightly in a bow at the back. "I don't have any friends," the red-haired girl said coldly. She was clearly unhappy with the fact that the letter even existed. "Come on, there's no need to be embarrassed." The maid waved the letter away, trying to calm her mistress. Finally, unfolding the letter, the girl read the contents, which in fact was not much. "Allocate some time today. I will come for you. Arthur." "What is it?" Barely audible, said the lady, still clutching the paper in her hand and also perplexed by the intrusiveness of the sender. She'd gotten involved with annoying people. I should have left it as it was, so she would have drowned then. The girl thought sadly to herself, still holding the envelope tightly and staring emotionlessly at the already opened envelope with her amber yellow eyes. "Why don't we do it this way? If you're so eager to study with your teacher, then you and I can just be friends." Suddenly the blond man's voice came to mind. But he said that friends are people who are always happy with each other and share each other's feelings and experiences. For moments she thought about it. As she continued her nostalgia, she didn't notice how she started to smile faintly. He also said that friends would help me cope better with life's difficulties. So maybe he was right? Can't something bad happen from just socializing? Reasoned the girl, going more and more into herself. It can't happen from the beginning. When they find out who I am, they will also despise me. Reminded the lady to herself, thinking back to that announcement. Row Chloe wanted, followed by her picture, and the amount they were willing to give for her head $1 million. I have no future in trust. "Since you've received the invitation, will you go to the meeting tonight?" The maid's voice came from behind her, pulling the red-haired girl out of her musings. "No, I'm not going anywhere." The girl cut her off, still staring at the text of the letter. Outside the window, they heard the stomping of hooves from several horses. A snow-white carriage was coming to them, so white that it even seemed to sparkle, reflecting the sunlight. And in the carriage sat an equally sunny and snow-white madam. "Hello, Ro." Smiling radiantly, and without stopping to wave almost aggressively, the girl greeted. She was very beautiful. Long, snow-white hair that was slightly blue at the roots. Light blue eyes, and the same color light dress. "Cecilia, what's wrong?" the red-haired girl asked, perplexed. "I heard from Arthur that she warned you. Or do you really know nothing?" It turned out that the blonde not only looked like an angel, but also spoke in a very gentle, affectionate voice. "I got a letter this morning." Ro answered her, looking at the letter she had read dozens of times, but she had never let it out of her hands. It was wrinkled in some places, but that didn't change its content. With a quick movement of her blonde hand, the red-haired girl showed the slightly crumpled and slightly worn paper with the familiar text to her guest. "Make some time today. I will come for you. Arthur." So he didn't explain anything. The blue-eyed girl replied in a slightly surprised, shy voice after a quick glance at the letter. She nervously touched her neck and then carelessly tucked a snow-white lock of hair behind her back, still rubbing her neck awkwardly. "To be honest, the big reception starts from today," the blonde whispered excitedly. "Big reception?" the red-haired girl asked again. "Ro, you're not really interested in social events, are you?" The girl took a small step closer to her companion. "The grand reception is the largest ball held at the Imperial Palace. And then it turns into a festival in the center of the city where all the aristocracy gathers." A vivid picture of loud fireworks, a sea of alcohol, and glowing lanterns immediately appeared in front of my eyes. "That's how," briefly replied the girl. "Today is the first day of the festival. There will be a lot of interesting things. Ro, let's go together." The blue-eyed girl started gesticulating again and smiled in a friendly, wide smile. Her cheeks even blushed a little. "I don't want to. I don't like large crowds of people," the red-haired girl replied emotionlessly. It was as if she was not looking at the girl, with the appearance of an angel, trying to get her out of the manor, but at an empty place. There was near chaos going on in the busy city street. Someone was walking with his wife to get groceries, young couples were walking with their children, and some street children were wandering alone, looking at the groceries and buildings. The old people were not lagging behind either. They were just as eager to enjoy the lead up to the holiday. "Why am I here?" the red-haired girl thought to herself sadly, looking at the stalls and people wandering the streets just like her. "It's beautiful, isn't it? It'll be even better tonight." The high-pitched voice of a smiling Cecilia rang overhead. "Hello, Ro," Arthur's voice suddenly sounded. There was another man with him, Noel. "Arthur, you haven't explained anything to Roja at all," Cecilia exclaimed, glaring menacingly at the golden-haired guy, while Noel could only stare blankly at the red-haired girl. "But you came together anyway," the blonde replied cheerfully, smiling in a friendly manner. Cecilia almost pounced on him with fists, clearly not with joking intentions, not even caring about the people around them. "Noel, these clothes." The red-haired girl, looking perplexed at the guy with snow-white hair, didn't know how to continue the question, but thought to herself, "I've seen it somewhere before." He was wearing a black and white suit, with small inserts of yellow, black tie, and white gloves. The guy proudly replied, "This is the uniform of the Order of Knights. There will be a lot of people at the party tonight, so I'll be keeping an eye on security. So why aren't you at your post at this time?" Still puzzled, the girl with amber eyes asked. "Cecilia, put that down," Arthur said awkwardly, looking at the blonde girl. "I have some free time on my hands right now. I am awaiting orders from the head of the order, who has gone on his rounds." In a slightly pensive voice, rubbing his chin, the young man with snow-white hair continued, looking somewhere in the depths of the street. "He's probably drinking somewhere by now. He's a rather idle man," Noel continued in a disgruntled voice. Clearly he had come across such a picture more than once before, where a man with epaulets had drunk enough alcohol. "But I can enjoy the holiday too. That's great, isn't it?" He tried to continue optimistically. Somewhere on the street stood a grocery vendor with his counters full of fruit, waiting for a long time in a dark den and waving a colorful, rainbow-colored ice cream cone. He would hide from the pesky sun under a yellow awning. And somewhere another vendor would be shouting and clapping his hands, who also wanted to be bought fruit or vegetables. He would shout to everyone about the value of his goods, hoping that he would be the one chosen among all the vendors. In the fourth, they went for a walk through the streets. "What do you think? Isn't it nice here? This is the largest festival of the empire. Many merchants from other countries come here." Cecilia's voice rang out, smiling and looking at everything in sight. "What good is that?" Ro thought to herself, not understanding how people could like such large gatherings of people. She certainly didn't feel good here, and she certainly wasn't happy to be here. Walking a little ahead, a young man with golden hair looked back and noticed a red-haired girl flushed with anger, with amber eyes, frowning eyebrows, a tense face, and a look like she intended to kill someone. "Look at this line," came the voice of one of the guys. Ahead of them was a huge line of very different people. Among them were very young children, men in the dawn of their youth, and most likely still unmarried women. "Why lined up there?" Ro asked. "They probably want to buy strawberry mochi." "Have you tasted them?" asked Cecilia, looking at the line. "No, I've never tried them." The other girl answered her. "It's my first time in a place like this," Ro thought to herself. She too began to look at the queue in the street. They got closer to the store where the queue was. Then their gaze fell on a dessert. It had small slices of strawberries on it, chocolate underneath, and laying it all on small, pink, round slices. It looked very tasty and appetizing. "It's an oriental dessert with strawberries inside. Would you like to try it? It's delicious." The blonde's voice rang out as she stared at the dessert behind the glass. Her hair was already a little disheveled. There were a couple of loose strands, but she didn't care much about that. Finally, the blonde exclaimed, "Wait a bit, I'll buy a moti." She almost jumped up and down. "Arthur, meet me later at the central bridge. Come on, Noel." It looked as if Noel had no choice, but he didn't resist Cecilia's childish enthusiasm. "What? Cecilia?" the red-haired girl uttered in confusion, who had only to stare confusedly into the distance of the street, where a girl with snow-white hair and light eyes and an almost identical-looking guy had just stood. Chuckling a little awkwardly, the guy suddenly started a dialogue. "Cecilia seems to care a lot about you." Without stopping smiling, he looked at Roja. "About me? But why?" the girl asked him, staring blankly at the same spot. "Just how to put it?" Confused, the golden-haired man tried to pick up the words without stopping smiling in a friendly manner, though he was clearly not very happy. His bangs were falling a bit over his eyes, and there were a few hairs sticking out of his hair. Not surprising, since they were at a lively party. "Do you need a knife?" the man asked his companion in surprise, but she was too engrossed in the counter in front of her. A middle-aged man stood there, smiling happily at possible customers, and on the table were several dozen knives, silver, wooden, with sheaths, and without. "Needed for the use of magic." Finally, the red-haired girl answered. She took the small silver knife and focused her attention solely on it. It fit easily in her hand, so one could assume it was folding or pocket-sized. "So, the knife is a tool for your magic?" asked the young man who was observing her choice of knife. "Something like that?" The girl answered him. "This is the first time I've heard of using a knife for spells." The blond man spoke in a perplexed manner. "Really?" Ro was a little surprised, but after a couple of moments she continued to choose a knife. "I use gems. I have mineral magic." Greetingly continued the dialogue with the blond man, sometimes wearing jewelry, but more often these gloves with gemstones. The guy leaned his hand to his chest, showing a white glove. "Stones? Surely it must be very expensive." The girl looked at Arthur with surprised eyes. "True, if it weren't for our family's situation, I might have lived my whole life without being able to use magic. For me, stones are expendable." The boy continued almost emotionlessly. "So my life is a kind of consumable too," Ro thought to herself. The girl's gaze darkened and fell downward. "Though if the doses aren't lethal, I won't die." She continued her musings. "I have relatively economical magic," the red-haired lady finally replied. "What?" "I didn't hear you," the blond man said apologetically. "No, nothing. Let's move on." Turning around, the red-haired girl walked in the opposite direction from the man with whom she had a rather large height difference, signaling that the conversation was over. "It felt like our dialogue was cut off in the middle," the guy whispered sadly as he exhaled, covering his eyes and rubbing the back of his once neatly styled hair a little confusedly. He was clearly trying to hide his excitement and his musings. An image of a girl with red long hair, black clothes, short skirt, and long socks walking briskly wherever she was going appeared before his eyes. Though she's a mage, she's still very unusual. He reasoned as he watched her follow. Most mages learn their emotions from their mage parents. He imagined an ordinary, unremarkable picture, a woman with long, wavy hair tucking her newborn baby into bed, wrapping it in a blanket. They learn basic human feelings such as fear of death, morality, empathy, and love. Can adapt in society and learn to use their strengths to their advantage. This is what most children go through with their family: mom, dad, mom, grandma, sister, brother. Usually, at about 12 years old, such young mages are almost no different from their peers. But it was as if Ro hadn't traveled that path at all. The golden-haired man reasoned with regret as he watched the red-haired girl's silhouette moving away. She had saved Cecilia, and her behavior was not out of line. Her mind flashed back to that day. I remembered her sitting on the grass, completely unconcerned, and the phrase he'd thrown at her, "You saved Cecilia." He was very grateful to her then and now. But looking at her walking down the street among the people, there was a sense of her detachment. The blond man was paralyzed and couldn't even move. He did not notice anyone around him, looking only at her and completely immersed in his thoughts. There was a strong sense of tension with the world, perhaps even hostility. He remembered her profile: wary eyes, tight lips. That's the look of people who are always ready to leave everyone behind in an emergency. To be honest, I'm worried about her. Mages who haven't learned to feel are capable of hurting people. They are loved by the people around them, and they start to destroy everything, thus becoming a danger to society, destroying themselves and everything around them. It wasn't hard to imagine Roja burning everything she didn't like in a fire. Ro was already lost in the crowd, and it was hard to find her in the crowd. She's only 15, but she's only a child after all. She needs protection, Arthur decided firmly, ending his musings and returning to the real world. "Ro, you better hold hands. It might be too dangerous in a crowd like this." A man in a dark green suit and golden hair shouted after her, but she just kept walking, not paying the slightest attention to him. Finally, turning around for a few moments, the girl answered the guy. "I can walk alone." The wind ruffled her red locks of hair. Her eyes sparkled in the sunlight, as did the golden brooch with a ruby on its bow tied on the collar of her shirt. "You're in danger of getting lost." Once again, a familiar male voice behind her repeated her with a shout, "I'll never get lost. Don't treat me like a child." Disgruntled, the lady cut her off, turning around again and moving as far away from the crowd as possible. "What?" he said, but no one heard him. In the end, the guy with the golden eyes could only stare at her confusedly, hoping he wouldn't lose sight of her in the mad, tearing down crowd, for God only knows what might happen in the next moment. "Ro, where are you?" Again he said, barely audibly. He hadn't been able to keep track of her, and she was lost in the faceless crowd. And no matter how many times he tried to find anything like her red, scarlet hair again, he couldn't find even a resemblance. Breathing heavily, the boy, as if voicing his thoughts, said, "When walking with a small child, you should always hold their hand." It sounded more like a reminder to himself. He scratched the back of his head with his hand through his long abandoned hair. But that didn't matter at all right now. Ro walked forward some more. The noise of the crowd drowned out the cries of the white-haired young man walking behind her. The girl stopped and thought that somehow this was strange. At some point, she broke away from the Mage. She didn't know where she was now. The whole street was littered with identical-looking food stalls. The girl had said 30 seconds ago that she wouldn't get lost, but now she was ready to take her words back. After thinking for a bit, the girl decided that there were too many people there and she needed to get out of there first. She moved toward the deserted alleyway, saying that it was not she who was lost, but Arthur Robert who had lost her. With each new step, she walked farther away from the crowded shopping street. Ro followed the sidewalk behind the fence. If Arthur was looking for her now, finding her would be a very difficult task. The girl turned down an alley. She stopped abruptly and stared ahead. A painfully familiar feeling swept over her. Ro was plunged into a distant memory from her past life. She realized that she was now in the same unfortunate alley. The girl remembered running here once, hoping to find something edible. She often took refuge in this alleyway from people and family members. That day, an old shopkeeper had spotted her and rushed at the girl screaming to grab her. Ro deftly ducked between the facades of buildings, getting farther and farther away from the enraged man. He kept yelling, calling her an insolent rat. Another man from a neighboring shop came out screaming. The girl did not see his face. She only heard the creak of the iron door. Marquise Chloe's daughter remembered that in 3 years, in the not-too-distant future, this place would be her only hiding place. Vague memories of hiding in a hole in the wall amidst mountains of garbage in this very alleyway surfaced in her mind. Then she'd curled up in a ball and whispered quietly, almost silently, about how hungry she was. Now that the girl had broken away from the chase, she still didn't feel safe. Let's be honest, she never felt safe. Then a squeak was heard, and a moment later a mouse appeared between the huge bags that were filled to the brim with food and household waste. The little gray mouse reminded the girl of herself. Now she was standing in this very alley, still 3 years away from those events. Ro thought about how she was cold and hungry, and the air was damp and stinky. In this dirty and dark alley, she was hiding from evil people. But it was the only safe place. Both then and now, it was not pleasant for her to be here. She stood in complete silence, staring at one point. But she was snapped out of her musings by a nasty and mocking male voice. The man was saying that it was unusual to see such a rich maiden on this street. Ro turned around and saw that she was surrounded by 3 men. One of them was the old shopkeeper, and the other 2 were apparently working somewhere in the neighborhood. One of them asked her if she had run away from home. The girl looked at them with a completely blank and unemotional stare. She was neither scared nor sad. Rather, she looked at them with contempt. There were always nasty people in these alleys who would molest her. The men, apparently not noticing that their victim was not at all frightened, continued to talk. One suggested that she had quarreled with her mommy, and the other that she had quarreled with her boyfriend. But neither version was close to the truth. Ro decided that since the 3 men were being holier-than-thou and theorizing so derisively, it would be better to just tell them the truth. Maybe there was still a bit of humanity left in them, and they would try to help. So the girl told them she was lost. She wasn't sure if things were exactly the same as before, but it didn't take long for those nasty men to respond. The one in the middle began his rant about how sorry he was, and the ash-haired shopkeeper asked Riley if she knew what happened to people who got lost in these nooks and crannies. The lips of the man standing in the middle spread into a ghastly smile. He continued to speak, his tone sounding as if he were chewing on every word. He added that very funny things happened to the poor sheep that climbed over the fence. The girl had long known of the methods of this gang and the terrible things they did in the neighborhood. She continued to stare at them with the same blank stare and said she wouldn't advise them to touch her. The men burst out laughing, and Ro thought that she was quite tired of everyone thinking she was a little girl and weak. The men laughed and exclaimed loudly how hilarious it was that the little brat was telling them not to touch her. Because she looked young, the men around her thought she was easy prey. They saw that Ro was weak, and then she became their target. She had to cope with the villains that surrounded her on all sides. She was so sick of it. The girl looked down. Her eyes read hatred, and her voice became cold and iron. The girl hissed through her teeth that it seemed they were so stupid that they didn't understand the warnings. The gang leader's face changed dramatically. He became more than serious. The man reached forward and grabbed Ro by the collar. Then he pulled the girl closer to him, lifting her slightly into the air. He unleashed angry remarks in the direction of Ro Chloe. The girl's hands dangled relaxedly somewhere below. She didn't make any sudden movements and didn't really try to get out of the grip. The girl moved her finger lightly and then leisurely raised her entire arm, bending her elbow. Ro covered the man's hands with her own, repeating once more for those who were particularly gifted that it was best not to touch her. Her voice still sounded menacing, and there was not a trace of fear or excitement in it. Count Chloe's daughter stared straight into the soul of this vile man. Then she touched once more with her hand, the man's hands clutching her collar. The girl repeated for the last time that she had warned against being touched. Her eyes filled with steely anger. Suddenly the man's face changed dramatically. He froze in bewilderment, and for a split second even loosened his grip. He certainly did not expect the girl to use any measures for self-defense. The attacker felt a sharp pain in his arm. Blood gushed from the wound. The girl had just cut his arm. The man was puzzled at first and then thought that her tricks would probably end there. What else could this little trashy girl do? At the same time, in a parallel alley, a little higher up than the one where the three men were harassing Roy, a boy was being shouted out of some establishment. The shopkeeper shouted furiously at him not to interfere with his trade anymore. The boy ran like a madman, hearing the shopkeeper's questions about what kind of inspections he was doing at the beginning of the day. He turned his head slightly and replied that he should have watched his trade properly. He continued talking, adding that if there were a lot of hooligans, there should be inspections as well. The boy stopped to catch his breath just outside the entrance to the parallel alley. He heard a male voice loudly ask why she cut his arm. This exclamation sounded quite loud and seemed interesting to the boy, so he turned his head, looking in the direction of the conflict that was beginning. He noticed three men flanking someone. One of them mumbled that he would see what she would do to them. The young man quickly climbed down to the tier below and struck one of the men attacking the girl from behind with all his might. As he swung, he shouted that there was something wrong with security here too. The leader of that criminal trio fell to the cold asphalt with a scream. The two remaining men looked sharply in the direction of the one who had just neutralized their brother in one move and asked with one voice who he thought he was to interfere. The young man, on the other hand, didn't understand why there was always so much commotion during the festivities. The boy was dressed plainly, even, one could say, not very neatly. But when asked who he was, he replied that he was the assistant leader of the night order. From his appearance, it was hard to tell that, so the men didn't believe it. Seeing their reactions, the young man started fumbling through his pockets, asking them to wait until he found his documents. He couldn't remember where he had shoved the damn ID card, so the search took some time. The man the newcomer had sent lying on the floor a few minutes ago jumped up sharply and finally pulled the knife out of the wound on his arm. He wanted to make a joke about how if this Nosh was the order leader's assistant, then he was someone Zero known as well, but he was prevented from finishing. The young man shrieked with joy that he had found the ID. He clutched a blue card in his hand with an engraved shield, crown, and 2 swords. The boy emphasized the 2 swords. That's when the men believed him. Everyone abruptly threw themselves into a run with shouts and exclamations. The men, though they were the last scum, still wanted to live. The young man waved at them and with warmth in his voice told them to watch their step and not to fall. Rose stood beside the knight. When the 3 were out of sight beyond the horizon, the young man turned to the red-haired woman. He asked if she was hurt and said that this street was too dangerous to be out here alone. The girl objected, saying that she did not need rescuing and that the danger was more to them than to her. As she said this, she realized that the gang had taken away her new knife, which she had just bought. The young man, perplexed, asked how she was going to deal with them. Ro replied that she just wanted to repay evil for evil, but he got in the way, so it didn't work. The girl's gaze seemed to darken even more. She hadn't raised it since this assistant leader of the Knights arrived. A tension hung between them. Ro was worried about losing her new knife, while the young man thought that this girl was still so young but already so cruel. The two didn't dare look at each other lest they encounter a contemptuous stare. The man touched his hand to the girl's head, ruffling her hair. He said clearly, with a smile on his face and no shame in his voice, that in such cases it was customary to simply thank him for his help, and called Ro a little girl. The red-haired girl immediately looked up at him, batting his hand away from her hair. She interjected rather aggressively, "Who else is the babe here?" Her eyebrows drew down to the bridge of her nose, her whole look showing irritation. After a couple of seconds of looking at the features of the young man who had just gotten into an altercation with 3 shopkeepers, the girl froze in bewilderment. She had definitely seen this face before, and it was not the best of memories. He thought that the girl's sudden change of emotion was due to the fact that he had called her little girl, so he asked, "What's the big deal if he called a little girl a little girl?" The smile did not leave the young man's face. He looked at the girl with a certain amount of compassion in his gaze. Chloe kept thinking that this smiling and gesticulating man who was standing in front of her was already familiar to her. They had spent a lot of time together in their previous lives. Only one thing the girl sincerely did not understand. Why did she meet him now, not at another time? After all, in her previous life, they had not yet met. Remembering this, her gaze darkened even more. The man felt a little strange as the girl stared at him with a steady gaze as if she intended to burn a hole in him. He asked her why she was looking at him like that, adding that, of course, he knew he was cute. Rose stood motionless. She was silent for a few seconds, dispelling the last bits of memories. This man was a far cry from the one she had known in her previous life. At least that was what she wanted to believe. The girl said she was just surprised by his cheerful face. The day when the sky was covered with gray clouds and many people gathered around the grave was vivid in her memory. Ro was among them, and a man stood motionless in front of the gravestone. It seemed that he was still unable to bid farewell to the deceased. He remained standing still, unwilling to move away. The man didn't even bother to turn around or even turn his head. He turned to Roja, standing in the crowd of people, asking her to listen carefully to his words. After a moment's thought, he gave out in a firm and angry voice a sentence about how much he hated her. The man's eyes looked lifeless, dark circles under them. The only thing that did not lose color in the gray picture was the ruby shining on his tie. Ro, too, remained standing where she was. Her hair was gathered in a bun. She said that if he wanted a divorce, that's what they would do. She didn't care at all. This man who had told her of hatred was her husband, and also was the very man who had just come to her rescue. The girl came back to reality from her musings. The man was just asking if she didn't like him, saying that it wasn't quite right since she was still a little girl. These words put the girl into an even bigger stupor. Ro looked away, not wanting to look at the man who had caused her so much suffering. She thought that this man didn't know about her yet. The girl then asked him to walk her to the central square, as that was where she was supposed to meet her friends, according to legend. The man smiled radiantly again. He sarcastically said that it was not necessary to save her, but to show her the way. The knight told the young lady to follow him. He was ready to lead her to the main square. After a few minutes of leisurely walking, the two emerged from a network of dark alleys. There was no longer as much chance of running into bandits or other interesting personalities here. Ahead of them were steps that led directly to the central square. The man pointed at them with his finger. The girl stared at the steps and said without hesitation that one of her acquaintances was already standing there. The rather familiar figure of the young man who had recently lost her flashed before her gaze. Ro froze in place. Arthur put his fingers to his temple, thinking about something. It was obvious that he had been worrying about someone for a long time. The knight accompanying the girl asked if this person was the acquaintance the girl was talking about, to which he received an affirmative answer. The mage saw Ro and took a quick step towards her. At this time, the man decided that it was vital for him to set the little girl straight. He asked if this was her suitor, adding, "That dating is fine, but she shouldn't be out late. She should have gotten home early." The girl said it wasn't her suitor, and the man replied that at her age, everyone says that. This picture seemed rather strange, for in the past they had been husband and wife, and now they were so carelessly throwing around words about suitors and dates. Then the red-haired woman turned around, deciding to head towards Arthur, who kept running to meet her. The last thing she said was that she was going to leave. The girl also said goodbye to the knight, calling him by his name, Keynes. Such an address shocked the man. He could not remember when he had blurted out his name. Keynes was perplexed, his eyes rounded and his eyebrows raised. He quietly asked her what she meant, but the girl had already run too far away to hear it. Then he stammered a little louder and said something resembling agreement, and said goodbye as well. A slight blush was visible on his face. Had being addressed by name moved him so much? The red-haired girl went up the steps and met Cecilia Richard. Mrs. Richard asked her where she had been. Meanwhile, the man who had shown her the way stood still, mumbling to himself that Ro hadn't even turned around. Still, he was pleased to see that she was with her friends. This girl looked so sad, and her eyes were so gloomy that the first time he met her, he thought she had no friends at all. Keynes remembered her saying a few minutes ago that she just wanted to repay evil for evil. He vividly remembered the coldness in her voice and the look of hidden malice in her eyes. It had struck fear into even him, a seasoned knight. Remembering it, he continued to smile. In his opinion, she sounded as if the whole world had turned its back on her, but in reality it wasn't like that. It seemed to him that this girl didn't have such a bad life. Then he decided to take a little walk down the main street since he'd come out here. That's when the realization came to him. Today was the first day of the holiday, after all. The street was so beautiful and crowded, but at the same time so lonely. The man remembered how the girl had called him by name when saying goodbye. He thought her words sounded a little unusual. He thought it might have been because of her appearance, but he wasn't entirely sure. He looked away and began to berate himself for the dirty thoughts that flashed through his head. He had been asking himself a second ago what he could have with such a little girl, and now he didn't want to think about it. Keynes was walking down the sidewalk on the main street, trying to avoid passers-by and not crash into anyone inadvertently. Then he stopped right in the middle of the busy street. The man froze, staring at one point somewhere ahead. Only now did he realize that he had not told her his name. Now that reference was playing out in new colors in his mind. He couldn't put the thoughts out of his head so easily anymore. He really wondered what was wrong with this little girl. It was already getting evening outside. The crowd was slowly becoming much calmer and more moderate, though it was growing in numbers. There were completely different, unrelated people at the festival. Some aristocrats strolling leisurely through the square, the homeless and poor children running around for sweets. "Ro, are you all right, Ro? Where have you been?" Almost in unison asked the golden-haired man and Cecilia, looking worriedly at the red-haired girl, who was a little surprised by their concern. "We've been looking for you for so long." Stretching every word and smiling widely, the blonde said, looking at her mate. She was holding some kind of baggie tightly in her hand, ostentatiously showing it to Roja. Arthur perplexedly turned to the blonde and asked, "Cecilia, are you drunk?" The girl immediately replied, "No, I'm not drunk at all," she exclaimed. "Then you have been drinking?" The man with the golden eyes asked tiredly. Cecilia raised her hands in a conciliatory gesture. "There was a tasting, and I had one glass. But I'm not drunk at all." Her cheeks turned slightly pink, and her eyes opened wide, not understanding why she was being asked that. "Noel, why didn't you do something?" Arthur asked, perplexed. "I talked her out of it. She wouldn't listen." As if apologizing, the blonde answered him. "A headrest," the girl said cheerfully, chuckling. "Cecilia, I'm having a hard time." Ro tried to squeeze out of herself when the blonde had already placed her chin on her head. The blue-eyed girl hugged her companion sharply. "I love you so much, Ro," she exclaimed, still keeping her chin on her head. "I'm not that good," replied the girl to her that she was looking emotionlessly at the streets of the city. "Ro, you are a very good person. You saved me after all." "You're my benefactor," the blonde exclaimed, Taking the red-haired girl by the shoulder with one hand, she began to shake her, side to side. The girl with amber eyes, not knowing what to say, looked at her interlocutor incredulously. She tensed up, pondering her words to take in properly. Her lips pressed into one thin line, and her body tensed faintly. "That's right, I completely forgot," said the blonde. "Ro, try this one," she continued, fiddling with something in the bag. Cecilia blushed even more, even though the situation was funny. The girl looked awkwardly at her interlocutor. The blue-eyed blonde opened her friend's mouth almost forcefully, pushing the sweet strawberry treat into it. The red-haired girl couldn't even understand what was going on at first, but afterwards she explained it with a strong intoxication. Chewing slowly, the girl tried to understand the flavor of the treat given to her. She fixed her red hair, awkwardly tucking her front strands behind her ear so that they fell down her back. Ro thought. The blonde looked at the girl in surprise, astonishment leaning both hands to her lips, cheeks and nose, trying to hide her embarrassment. "Modi eats Modi! God!" gasped the blue-eyed girl. "When will Cecilia come to her senses?" asked the girl, feeling something squeezing her lungs hard. "What a sweetheart!" Cecilia shouted. "Not soon. Perhaps tomorrow she will be very ashamed when she remembers her behavior, and she will come to your house to apologize," Arthur replied, watching the embrace awkwardly. Pulling away from Ro, Cecilia went to her brother. "I feel sick." She leaned over to Noel. "Here's a bag for you," the boy answered her excitedly. "Looking at this," Arthur said, "looks like she's not new to this at all." The lady sadly shifted her gaze to the box of Japanese dessert that her companion gave her, concurrently shoving her strawberry treat into her mouth. She held it tightly so as not to drop it inadvertently. Finally, taking a chance, the girl picked up one of the 3 mochi lying in a white box on a red and white napkin. "It won't be a big deal if I take the second one already, right?" But she put the first one in my mouth herself, she thought. The red-haired girl finally took a small bite of the strawberry dessert. "Sweet," she thought. The lady smiled slightly with the edges of her smile. Looking at the treat, her gaze picked up, and her cheeks flushed a little. The girl wondered. It's the same life, after all, in which the same events should happen. Originally, my life was supposed to be uninteresting. She thought back to special moments. "It's customary to give thanks on such occasions, baby. Today is the first day of the holiday. It's going to be interesting. Ro, let's go together." But there are events that occur that are slightly different from what I remember. The girl continued to ponder. She remembered the smiling guy saying those very words to her. "How about this? If you don't feel like studying with the teacher." Next came his suggestion, which she didn't go into any further. "In return, we can be friends." In the end, that first choice to save Cecilia had other consequences. The picture of Ro rescuing the blue-eyed blonde girl surfaced in front of her eyes, saying, "I don't want to be called a murderer right now, but the new events won't change the future," the lady reminded herself. "If someone tries to kill me, I will definitely do the same thing. As a result, I will have to go on the run again," the girl pondered, walking side by side with Arthur. When she thought about her past, the red-haired girl's gaze faded and sank to the ground, becoming empty. "It's even hard to imagine that I could be living a completely different life in 3 years." "Ro, you're so serious. Did something happen?" the golden-haired man suddenly asked in a worried voice. "I just met someone I know," absent-mindedly replied the girl, who was suddenly pulled out of her train of thought. "Is this person unpleasant to you?" the man asked, puzzled, leaning slightly towards his companion. "No, not really, though he disliked me." The lady answered him, looking at him with wide-open amber eyes. "Some man disliked you, and you don't care?" Surprised, clarified the golden-haired guy. "I have no intention and desire to hate someone," the girl replied, shrugging her shoulders awkwardly. Arthur looked at the lady with his regretful, misunderstanding gaze of yellow eyes and asked, "Then, may I ask why you are so wary of this man?" He was careful not to pressure the little girl, and so he asked the questions carefully. The girl only looked at Arthur in surprise. "Beware? Me?" Ro barely audibly said. She opened her eyes wide again and stepped a little closer to the golden-haired man. It was already getting dark behind them, with stars visible somewhere in the distance. "You didn't know?" The blonde man interrogated the lady. "It's not that. I just don't want him to find out what I am and change his attitude," said the girl, awkwardly looking away. "And what are you like?" asked the man, not taking his eyes off her. The red-haired beauty's gaze grew heavy, as if the man had asked something that sometimes it was better not to say out loud. Rose smiled nervously, trying to find the right words. Yes, but I am. She wanted to continue, but immediately turned her attention to the beauty of the streets. When it got dark enough, it began to look like the streetlights were plugged in somewhere near the sky, so high were some of them. They looked like huge stars that had mistakenly fallen into the wrong universe. Without giving people a chance to stop the fun and go home, the lanterns burned brightly with sunlight near the windows of the apartment buildings. The windows reflected their light, though they didn't convey all the magic of the holiday. The four friends stopped abruptly, staring at the street, where more lanterns were being lit with each passing second. Cecilia ran the closest, peering at their device. Ro marveled at every lantern, every streetlit, every house, every mirror. She opened her eyes wide, watching the bright light that was already in her eyes. Suddenly a slight breeze blew, flicking her hair back. Watching the red-haired girl's reaction, the blonde finally turned away and said, "See, I told you it would be beautiful here tonight." Ro was still looking at the lighted streets, finally responding with a subtle nod. "That's right. It's the first time I've seen streetlights on the street." The girl thought sadly, not daring to take her curious amber eyes off the streets flooded with the golden, sunny light of the round lanterns. The girl did not notice the sounds of the buzzing crowd near her, did not notice the conversations of the guys behind her. She was completely immersed in the landscape. "I'm more used to that stinking alley," thought the lady, remembering the countless days lived there. It seemed like there would be no end to them, and now she would have to relive it all over again. The girl continued to clutch her modi tightly while standing in the middle. "It feels like I'm in a place where I shouldn't be." The girl pondered, not hearing the laughter behind her. Cecilia turned to her to say something, but she paid no attention to her. "Still, if my life is a little different," thought the red-haired girl, "perhaps I can get out of that darkness." Ro pondered, remembering all that time spent in a nook full of trash and dirt. Suddenly, someone grabbed her hand sharply but not hard, pulling her behind her. For a moment, the lady was startled out of her senses as she was once again pulled out of the flow of thoughts and musings. It was the blue-eyed blonde Cecilia who was addressing her companion in a friendly manner. "Let's go quickly," the red-haired girl, perplexed, asked her. "What? But where to?" She looked at her companion confusedly. "There's no time left." Laughing heartily, the drunken girl shouted out, hoping that Ro would hear her in the maddening torrent of voices of the crowd. They were all rushing to see the main event of the festival. The red-haired girl looked at the blonde in surprise, pressing her lips into one thin line as if trying to hold back the incoming tears. She was tense, and there was nothing she could do about this feeling of being out of place. After a bit of thought, though, she came to a different conclusion. Finally taking a chance, the lady gripped Cecilia's hand firmly in a way that she couldn't let go of it. Then she looked at her laughing face and realized, "It's not certain yet, but I think such a life as this." It was as if the girl was afraid to say those words further, even in her head. "There's fireworks." A ringing voice came from the crowd gathered over the river. Bright sparks reflected in the water, and the sky became colored for moments. People watched the salute intently, afraid that they would miss such an extraordinarily beautiful sight. The boys in the company had different reactions, though they were all excited about the day. Cecilia had been waiting for it for a long time, and so she watched excitedly. She was smiling. Noel was rather mesmerized by their beauty, not daring to look away. Arthur was smiling brightly and broadly, and Ro could not believe what was happening. The red-haired girl watched another volley of fireworks. Their flashes were so bright that they began to reflect in her deep, amber eyes. The overabundance of conflicting feelings made her slightly blush. The golden-haired guy turned to the red-haired lady. "What do you think? Not bad, right?" he said, not taking his golden eyes off the colorful salute. His hair was mussed by the wind, and he was smiling without stopping for a moment. "Yeah, that's pretty good." Finally, allowing herself to smile, the girl replied. Her eyebrows rose high, and her eyes were full of joy, though her bangs hid a small part of them. It was as if time was frozen in one moment, and Ro didn't want it to end. Somewhere in the distance, there was still a small crowd, for many had eventually left before the main event of the evening was over. There were knights, young women, and old people alike, eager to enjoy the festivities. Whatever the future holds, I would like to enjoy what I have now, firmly decided the girl, as a result of her long deliberation throughout the festival. All in the fourth, they watched and watched the last fireworks go off. A wide corridor covered with a patterned blue carpet and pedestals with indoor plants along it ended with double doors with fluted glass. There were muffled sounds coming from behind the doors, indicating that someone was feeling bad today, as they had been feeling good yesterday. Standing by the bathroom sink, a young man was moaning that he was very sick, and he was clearly not quite sober. The boy at the door reproachfully remarked that Keen should have drank less, because yesterday after work he drank until the early hours of the morning. Keynes turned to the young man standing in the doorway and gave him a less than friendly, more like suspicious look with his red eyes, wondering when he'd gotten here. Isaac replied that he had come only recently because he couldn't ignore the sounds his brother was making in the bathroom, as they were audible throughout the hallway, which was why he had come up to check on Keynes. He grudgingly grabbed his head and irritatedly said that his brother's voice made his head ring. Isaac continued to question him, trying to find out why his brother was always drinking and in such a state. Keynes Rodrigue replied with a sincere smile on his face that drinking always had such consequences. However, the guy's disheveled appearance gave Isaac a reason to restrict his brother from drinking, the consequences of which are not good for Keynes's health. Exhaling, Rodrigue noted that the boy's words were no excuse and wanted to continue their little argument, but Keynes quickly changed the subject, asking his brother again what he had been doing in his room since morning. Isaac said with a slight hesitation and averted his gaze that he had wanted to tell his brother something for a long time, but it had been so long since they had seen each other that there had been no opportunity to talk privately. In a tired and irritable state, Keynes turned towards his brother, asking what was so important that he had to tell him. The boy was clearly not thrilled to hear about it right now, but he simply had no choice. Isaac also wasn't happy that he had to talk about it now, because it would have been much better to say it in a more serious setting, and he was sorry to have to tell such important news under such circumstances. Behind the serious news that Isaac was able to tell his brother now was the engagement of the young lord. Keynes did not immediately grasp the meaning of the young man's words. He questioned his brother in bewilderment. The lad confirmed everything he had said earlier. But then Keynes finally realized the situation he was in and cried out in panic, accusing his brother of talking nonsense. Isaac reacted calmly, informing the young man that his bride would be the Marquis's daughter, Chloe. In shock, Keynes once again questioned his brother about Marquis Chloe. He knew the Marquis, it was evident from the face of the new bridegroom, which clearly did not display positive emotions about the engagement. Was it really the same Marquis Chloe whose son Keynes knew? Could it really be Leston Chloe's father? It wasn't clear from the look on the boy's face whether he treated his fiancée so badly, or whether Keynes didn't mind at all such an unexpected gift from his brother who had arranged their engagement. Isaac confirmed that his brother was right, and Leston's sister Chloe would be the young gentleman's wife. Also, he informed that the lad will see the girl for tonight at the ball. For Isaac, this engagement was something that pleased him, but the head of the Rodrigue family was afraid that his brother would not take it so joyfully. The majestic mansion of Chloe's family estate glistened in the sun with the eyes of numerous cleanly washed windows against the background of snow-white walls, which very organically combined with bright red tiled roofs. In one of the rooms of this mansion, deeply and somehow anxiously thinking, at a desk sat the only son of the owner of the house. In front of him lay a half-unfolded manuscript, flooded with bright light that poured from a high window behind the young man's back. Leaning on his arm and leaning slightly forward, his older brother Ro was pondering the engagement decision that had recently been made by his father, the Marquis of Chloe. Did this mean that his father might know everything? It was only recently that he had found out. The young man tried to argue with his father, saying that Ro was too young for an engagement. She was only 15 after all. In response, the Marquis made it clear to his son that the decision was final and could not be appealed, because they had already agreed and both parties needed this union. He sincerely wanted to prevent his adamant father, but there is nothing he can do. Now, young Mr. Chloe wondered how to inform Roya about it, so as not to traumatize her with the recent decision on the engagement to Keynes Rodrigue. However, Leston did not have time to choose the right words because the girl entered the office of her brother, greeting him. Roe asked the boy from the doorstep why he needed her. The girl's green eyes stared intently at the young man in such a way that he had to look away. Linston started from afar, informing the lady that she would have to go to the ball without him. Roe barely reacted to the news, telling her brother that she didn't care and the young lord shouldn't worry about it. After his sister's reply, he went straight to the main point, telling the girl that their father was not giving in to persuasion from his son, and most likely Roe will have to marry the Marquis Chloe's chosen one. However, to this the girl also reacted quite differently from what Linston thought. She said that it did not matter, and it was obvious from Roe's face that she really did not care about the bonds of marriage in which the lady wanted to be enclosed. The young man began to worry even more and inquired if it was definitely all right. The girl explained to her brother that it was going to happen at some point anyway, and there was no point in worrying about it. The boy agreed with Roe, saying that he probably saw his sister as a little girl. When the young man looked away, Roe immediately realized that this was not going to be followed by a very pleasant conversation. And that was indeed the case, for the young gentleman had decided to remind her of the words that had been bothering Lindstone. Not immediately realizing what words they were talking about, Roe asked her brother to clarify, to which the boy replied that he was interested in those words that his sister had said in the corridor. The girl still didn't understand exactly what words the young gentleman was talking about. Linston once again ran through in his head everything his little sister had said that day. The words that they were not a family at all were deeply embedded in the boy's heart, for he had never once thought about what Roe had felt when he and his father had paid little attention to the young lady. Words to the effect that in a real family, isn't it important to be treated with kindness and fond memories of each other? However, there is no such thing between Roe and her brother, so can they be considered a complete family if there is absolutely no feelings between them? Linston realized that it was best not to remind his sister of all of this. The young lord exhaled heavily, asking the girl to forget about the boy's request about the words she had said in the bloody corridor, which could not let Linston go. Looking at the girl penetratingly with his clear gray eyes, the young man suggested that his only sister contact him any time the girl might need their family's help. Roe looked at her brother, whom she had never been close to before, with obvious doubt in her eyes. The girl decided that it was unlikely that she would need any help from him and immediately informed her brother of this. In her mind, Roe explained her refusal by the fact that at the most dangerous moment her brother would attack her instead of helping her. But out loud, she told him to forget everything she had said earlier, and then said that she was leaving, as she had to get ready for the ball. With these words, the girl headed for the exit of the room and, going outside, closed the door behind her with a light, almost inaudible click, leaving her brother alone to stare at the door slammed behind her. Young Mr. Chloe sat at the desk, staring unseeingly before him and rubbing his chin. He was thinking that his sweet sister was acting suspiciously, and he wondered if he had done something wrong. And then, at last, it was time for the ball. To the wide marble staircase, decorated with the coat of arms of the owners of the house, which led to the front door of the mansion, began to arrive luxury carriages, which were invited to the party lords and ladies. The guests filled the ballroom, strolling along the set tables, on which there was nothing. The variety and ornate dishes were amazing. In addition to the food, the table was also decorated with elegant candelabras with many candles and vases with flowers. Lady Cecilia was also among the guests. The girl approached Roya. She was red with embarrassment and shame, and clasped her hands to her breast. Cecilia embarrassedly apologized for what had happened yesterday when they were spending time in the city. But Roe assured her newfound friend that she had fun, especially since it was the first time the girl had seen how alcohol could affect a person. However, Cecilia was not at all reassured by these words. She explained her behavior by the fact that she was too overexcited, but the girl's expressions of love were sincere. Roe looked at her interlocutor in utter bewilderment, not quite understanding what kind of sincere love she was talking about. Could this lady have any warm feelings for her if she didn't know her at all? Cecilia drew Roe's attention to the cakes that looked tempting on the plate next to the various desserts. The lady promised that as an apology, she would tell her friend a very important thing and called her closer to the table with sweets. Pointing to a pastry, the girl asked if Ro had ever tasted such a dessert and told her that these pastries could only be tasted in the imperial palace and had saffron added to them. Cecilia then showed her a meat cap cake. The meat came from the southwestern lands, and her friend must try them. With a smile, the girl held out the brownie to Roja, assuring her that it was her favorite sweet. And Lady Chloe was only finally convinced that Cecilia is the complete opposite of Leston. So that was what her future daughter-in-law was like. Studying her friend, Ro couldn't help but notice that something was actually pulling her closer to this girl. She did not know how to express her feelings. She wanted to say that Cecilia was very nice. She always smiled sincerely, her hair was beautifully arranged on her head, and the drink in her hands looked quite elegant. Wherever Cecilia is, the atmosphere there immediately becomes lighter and brighter. It felt as if every situation changed for the better with her arrival. Like a ray of light, she illuminated the ballroom with her presence, giving it a kind of cozy and comfortable feel. But Ro couldn't help but wonder why such a bright and radiant girl would marry her cold brother. Was it because of the love that had sprung up between the two, or was it something else? The girl was left to wonder about it. However, if Cecilia simply attracts people's attention, then the person who leads them is Arthur Robert. Ro's gaze turned to the golden-haired young man who stood surrounded by noble ladies in the middle of the ballroom. Arthur smiled embarrassedly and slightly encouragingly at each of the ladies. It was hard not to notice the excitement of the girls around the young man. Arthur had no special achievements yet, but he was very popular, probably because of his looks. Both girls watched the young magician's admirers in amazement, agreeing that Arthur was extraordinary after all. And then Arthur noticed the two girls watching him intently. Earlier, his light brown eyes with a greenish tinge had repeatedly run through the room in search of Lady Chloe, with whom they had become good friends recently, as well as Lady Cecilia, who was to accompany her to the ball. At last finding them, Arthur did not hesitate to address the girls by their names. Both were not particularly thrilled to be discovered, especially as the eyes of the horde of girls clustered around him turned sharply to them. They clearly wished with all their being that Arthur would not dare approach Roy and Cecilia. And yet the young man approached them, smiling welcomingly. Ro immediately suggested that they move away from the enthusiastic girls, because Arthur would bring other people here who were not invited at all, and it would be uncomfortable for everyone. The young man reminded Roja that when people found out that she was a mage, she too would have no shortage of admirers who wanted to socialize. After all, mages had always been an object of curiosity in society. Cecilia disagreed with Arthur, however, noting that it wasn't just because Ro was a mage. The young man agreed with this statement with perfect docility. Then, smiling meaningfully at the girls, he added that there are usually several reasons why people show attention to someone. When those around him saw the young man smile, it was as if he bloomed like a flower to them. Thick, golden hair and enchantingly beautiful green-brown eyes. Arthur addressed Cecilia as if she were no less beautiful in comparison to the young man. The girl at once realized what Arthur was going to ask her to do, for because of the young man, no one would approach the poor girl for a dance. She tried to justify her refusal by saying that she valued their friendship, but the young lady also wants a romantic relationship. With the same smile, Arthur said that he did not mind his friend's romantic relationships with guys from the society, and let Cecilia dance with other guys as much as she wanted, but now he asked her to dance. Without much joy, the lady took the hand of the insistent young man, and they swirled in a beautiful dance, dazzling everyone around with their grace and elegance. Before accepting Arthur's hand, however, Cecilia promised the young man that this was the last time she would agree to his entreaties. Sweet Cecilia and the respected magician Arthur Robert looked magical together. The dance was quite dynamic, so their clothes developed, enveloping the two figures in an enchanting halo. Even the pendant on Cecilia's neck flew in front of her in a rhythmic dance. Many people thought that these two were a beautiful couple. From everywhere in the ballroom were heard whispers of guests who were discussing the young people who were dancing in the center of the ballroom. One girl marveled at how beautiful they looked together, and the others supported her, calling Cecilia and Arthur a very beautiful couple. Ro remained standing near the table with desserts, holding in her hand the cupcake previously offered to her by Cecilia, and carefully watched what was happening. For herself, the girl realized that too much attention was just as annoying as the general hatred of others. Hiding an ironic smile, Ro appreciated Arthur's cleverness in driving away a bunch of annoying girls who wanted to dance with the young and handsome magician. Most likely, he invited Cecilia to every ball to free himself from unnecessary attention. Taking a bite from the cupcake her friend had recommended to her, Ro was pleasantly surprised by the taste of such an exquisite sweet. The cake was very good, and the girl, who was not very selective in her eating, couldn't resist enjoying such an outstanding dessert. If Ro were still the same beggar that lived in the dark alley, she would have tried everything on the table. But now the girl is a noble lady who is not allowed to forget about her manners and reputation, because such a prank will not have a good impact on the overall reputation of the whole family Chloe. It was all well and good, but after looking at the abundance of dishes from which the tables were bursting, Ro decided to go somewhere private and try a piece of each offered dessert. After all, these sweets looked so appetizing, which made the girl to indulge herself and get as much pleasure as possible from being in this place. Meanwhile, one of those who had been watching very closely the beautiful dance of Arthur Robert and Cecilia lurked behind one of the columns of the ballroom, watching the couple as they finished their dance and talked peacefully. Her whole appearance suggested that this lady was obviously up to something very bad. This girl in a stylish black dress raised her hand, covering her mouth with it, her eyes glittering insidiously. In her thoughts were clearly conceived insidious, strongly unpleasant for the guy and girl in her sight. Away from unwanted ears, the three girls were discussing about the most important guest of the ball. He was the emperor. They were saying that apparently he wouldn't be attending the ball this time either. As far as they knew, he wasn't feeling well again, so they kept talking about him. Out of sight, Ro ate all the cakes she liked. She put her hand on her stomach and glowed with happiness as she thought about how delicious the cakes she had tasted were, while a group of girls stood far away from her, talking excitedly about something. During the meal, she could hear what the ladies were talking about. Their conversation made her ears tired, and she wanted to get away from the prying eyes. But the gossiping girls who did not shut their mouths for a minute were next to her. Suddenly, they turned from the discussion of the king to Cecilia after her dance with Arthur, and their jealousy was kindled. They talked about how Cecilia was being a nice lady, said she was an impudent person and was admired for her pretty face, but she was using it to flirt. Their words about her being nasty reached Cecile herself. Ro noticed her nearby. She wondered if she had heard them all. She watched Cecile standing back and looking at the gossipers. She seemed very hurt by the words. The gossipers didn't stop, and Cecile just listened silently. Ro wondered how she would respond to them. She began to think of ways to teach them a lesson. She thought she could grab them by the scruff of the neck. Contrary to Ro's expectations, Cecile just ignored them. She turned and walked away as if nothing had happened. Apparently, this wasn't the first time she was an unwilling listener to gossip about her. The gossipers, not noticing those around them, continued to discuss Cecile. Turning to them, Ro, though reluctant, decided to intervene in their nasty conversation. Ro, who was on her way to the gossipers, accidentally bumped into one of the ladies from the ball. Apparently she was in a hurry to get somewhere, so she didn't notice Ro, and she didn't expect to see someone in such a remote corner of the castle. She was a lady with silver hair wearing a purple dress that matched the color of her beautiful eyes. She apologized to Ro, saying that she had been inattentive, and because of that they had bumped into each other. Ro said that it was okay because she hadn't noticed her either. Hearing someone nearby, the gossip girls were afraid to be overheard. They thought they had hidden themselves well, but they miscalculated. It was clear that they were not ready to be held accountable for their words. Ro realized that Ro wanted to teach the gossip girls a lesson and stopped her and told her not to mess with them and asked her if she had heard everything too. Ro answered in the affirmative, and after listening to the lady, she just watched them leave. The lady, in order to calm Ro's ardor, said that they were saying that because they were jealous of Cecilia, though that was too much, for they could not say anything but flattery to her face. The lady also saw Cecilia witnessing the talk about her. She suggested that Ro go and support the much upset Cecilia. She sympathized with her, but these feelings were foreign to Ro, and she only asked if she really should. The lady explained that since she didn't know Cecilia well, it would be better if Ro was the one to comfort her. But Ro didn't understand what comforting meant or how to comfort someone. She just asked again. Still just as incomprehensibly, Roe asked if she was correct in her understanding that the lady wanted her to comfort Cecilia. It was clear from her face that she had no idea what to do at all. Roe returned to the main ball venue in search of Cecilia. The guests were dancing and enjoying themselves, but Cecilia was not seen among them. Roe wondered where Cecilia had gone since she was not in the main ball venue. Roe had already given up hope of finding Cecilia. She thought that even if she did find her, it would not be any less of a problem. Roe had never comforted anyone or even seen anyone do it. She was puzzled by this. Roe didn't understand why Cecilia cared so much about these frivolous conversations. After all, if she had asked her to straighten them out, Roe would have agreed. Suddenly, Roe wondered why she was thinking so much about this situation. After all, what did she care how Cecilia felt? Suddenly, in the crowd of aristocrats, Roe saw Noel, Cecilia's brother, who looked back at her perplexed, not understanding why she was looking at him. She walked closer to Noel and told him she needed to talk to him. Roe thought to herself about the timing of their meeting. She thought it was better to entrust Cecilia's comfort to him. Noel stood in front of her puzzled, not understanding what she needed to talk to him about. The guy who had helped Roya in the back alley was also at the ball, yawning boredly, not participating in the dancing. He was dressed in black robes, standing on a balcony inside the building and looking at the people, leaning on his arm. Keynes was talking aloud to himself about what a boring ball it was, and that all the guests present at the ball were rather uninteresting people. Watching the glittering and crowded ball, suddenly, Keynes realized that among these guests there was his fiancée. Then he began to ponder who it could be. Still leaning on his arm, he began to think about his fiancée's family, that an engagement without his consent was already too much, and this is also Leston's only sister Chloe, who is 15 years old. For Keynes, the difference between them was decent. Suddenly his eyes were caught by two figures climbing up to the balcony he was standing on. These two figures turned out to be Noel and Roe, but Keynes didn't know the name of the other one, nor did he know the reason why they were climbing to the top. Keynes was visibly cheerful. He was glad to see them. At least this way he could not be bored alone anymore. He raised his hand in greeting and said that they had met again. He recognized Roe and described her as the lady he had met yesterday and helped. Noel and Roe reached the balcony. Noel, seeing a familiar face in the one greeting them, asked if he was the leader's assistant, and Roe, realizing that he had described her, answered in the affirmative. Keynes did not expect to see a stranger in Noel's company and asked her why he was with her, and if they were on a date. Noel said he wanted to ask him the same thing. He asked the assistant leader if they knew each other. Roe stood silently watching their conversation. Keynes replied with a smile that he had helped the lady find her way yesterday, and Noel asked if that was how they met when Roe got lost. He said it was amazing. He said that this was the man Noel had told Roe about yesterday. He said that he was the bushranger. Shocked, Keynes shouted and asked which bushranger he was talking about. Pitifully, Keynes said it wasn't too much to call him that. After all, yesterday when he was working, he was able to save the little girl and was also on duty, keeping order and safety of the residents. To which Noel sighed and said he had no doubt the deputy leader was known for his love of drinking, and so Noel was in no hurry to believe him. Keynes crossed his arms and asked how Noel could be dating such a young lady, and if he was afraid of heavenly punishment for his actions. Noel replied that they were just friends, and especially since they were only 3 years apart, he told Keynes not to judge him by himself. Roe, furious at being called a baby, said she wasn't a baby and he'd regret his hasty conclusions, her furrowed brow and narrow pupils showing how furious she was. Not taking Roe's words seriously, Keynes, mocking her and shrugging his shoulders as if he had nothing to do with it, said if she was a baby, she should be called a baby. Keynes sighed and smiled and said that if she didn't want him to call her baby, she should at least tell him her name. Then he asked her what her name was while Roe listened silently. Agreeing, Roe was about to say her name, but a loud rumble stopped her. From somewhere in the hall, unexpectedly, a loud rumble was heard. There was a loud female scream, and Noel, Roe, and Keynes looked in the direction of the sound, their eyes bulging. Smoke was clearing from the window. The crowd had gathered to gawk at something amazing. Trying to make their way through the crowd, Keynes politely told them to give way, and Roe walked alongside, passing the path cleared by Keynes. When they reached the scene, they saw Cecilia on the floor among the glass and pieces of wall, and Arthur trying to help her. Noel and Keynes came closer, and Noel asked if it was Cecilia. Keynes and Noel worriedly peppered them with questions, Keynes asking if they were hurt, for it looked serious, Noel asking his sister if she was all right and what had happened, while Roe looked at them in silence. Cecilia, still in shock, said that it looked like the evening had gotten too strong and it had happened. She said that Arthur was hurt more than her. Covered in debris from the glass and a scratched cheek, Arthur calmly said that he only had a small scratch on him. He also added that everything happened unexpectedly, and he didn't have time to use magic. Arthur said that the ball was over, but there were no royal servants in sight. He said that he should check what was wrong first. Noel asked Cecilia if she could get up. He told her to be careful as there was glass all around. Cecilia told her brother to wait as her legs had no strength at all. Roe was still looking at them silently and without any emotion on her face. She shifted her gaze to the glass and studied it. On the piece of glass, right under Roe's feet, someone's happy smile was visible. She realized that it couldn't be a mere coincidence. Despite the broken glass on the floor, Roe bravely walked forward on it. A thought came to her as to how to figure out who did this. Worried for Roe, Keynes warned her, saying it was dangerous. But Roe didn't listen to him. She needed to check something. Roe carefully picked up a rather large piece, apparently figuring out the whole situation could depend on this shard. As soon as Roe picked up the shard in her hands, it began to shake violently, but Roe wasn't even shocked. She looked at it with a calm face as if it should be. Squeezing the shard in her hand from her palm, a huge amount of blood spurted out, but Roe didn't even warp. She only said with a serious face that it didn't seem to be an accident, and someone asked her what it was then. Roe unclenched the shard, but it was covered in blood and started shaking with even more force. The shard rose upward, Roe's blood dripping from it. Lifting up the blood-smeared shard, Roe, frowning, replied that it was magic. All the shards rose up, joining the first one. Everyone could only watch what was happening. It looked like the answer was near. Roe's words shocked everyone. She said with a serious face that it was also attempted murder. The shards came together to reveal a horrible grimace that blurred into a ghastly smile. Roe stood there looking at it without a shred of fear. Cecilia was shocked by this horrible grimace. Suddenly, the shards started attacking, and pieces of glass flew toward Cecilia. Apparently, it was her life that was being attempted. The hall began to rumble. Everyone was surprised and frightened by the sudden events that unfolded. At the most ordinary ball, it seemed that it should have passed, calmly, but apparently the higher powers had other plans. Cecilia, who was lying on the floor, was paralyzed with fear. She silently looked at the beams of magic flying at her, and could not even fight back, because she had no magic to protect herself. But suddenly Roe intervened. She concentrated and directed all her magical powers to protect the girl, and now all who stood in the hall could watch the confrontation of two magical streams. But Miss Chloe realized that her power was not enough, and it was too weak control for a 15-year-old girl. She tried her best to keep her power, but realized that she could not do it for long. The girl's eyes showed that she was very serious, and no matter how difficult the battle was for her, she wanted to win. It seemed that she was beginning to do so, because an unknown force gradually began to flow back into the hole that had formed in the wall of the manor. The last spurts, and Roe was already looking at the white streams. Although the danger was almost over, there was still tension in the hall. Some were worried that the monster was not yet gone, and some were amazed at the way Miss Chloe had chased away the force. Arthur, who had been watching Roe all this time, was amazed. He didn't know that the girl had such strong mana, as well as he was surprised by Miss Chloe's reaction. For him, it was clearly beyond the magic of a 15-year-old. Mr. Keynes, who was also standing next to everyone, remembered how Roe had once told him that he would regret calling her little girl, and it seemed that moment had come. The man was amazed that she turned out to be a mage, and a fairly high-level one at that. All stood in the hall and looked into the hole that was formed in the wall. Miss Cecilia sat frightened, surrounded by shards of glass, and her friends and brother surrounded her. It seemed to them that the danger had passed, and everything was over. Miss Cecilia sat with her back against the wall, trembling. She still could not catch her breath after the attack, for at that moment it seemed to her that she would die, and that would be the end of her life. Roe was standing with her back to everyone. She watched as the glass shards, with the help of some unknown magic, began to rise to the top. She was no longer afraid, because she realized that if she was able to repel the attack of the force, she had nothing to fear. Miss Chloe turned to the shards. She firmly asked who the spirit was that was behind all these shenanigans. She tried to show that the unknown being would not frighten her, for to her it certainly did not seem scary. The spirit from the shards turned to the girl in response, a question for a question. He duplicated her question and asked her who she was. It was not clear whether these words sounded with a sneer or on the contrary. He wanted to know who she was since she was able to repel his attack. Suddenly a face began to emerge from the shards. It smiled and asked Ro how she dared to interfere with him. The creature was surprised to see the girl for the first time, so it said it liked her a lot. The creature said it wanted to see what the girl was capable of, so it attacked so suddenly, taking Ro by surprise. The mistress realized that she was not in the best condition to fight, because half of her strength had been used up in the first fight, so she stood there, gathering all her will in her fists to repel the attack to protect herself. Ro decided that if the creature had dared to attack her, she would gladly accept its challenge, so no matter how hard it was, she stood and prepared to use her magic again, for she had been endowed with it for a reason. Miss Ro Chloe began to summon streams of red energy like her hair. It became bigger and bigger. Of course, it was her last strength. And what the outcome of this battle was not clear, but even if it ended badly, the girl was ready for it. Mistress was already ready to attack, but suddenly Arthur jumped out right in front of her. With his appearance, he frightened the girl. The man was spinning a magic circle in his hand, something like a star. He said that it was time to put an end to this rampage. The guy was aggressive. With every second his magic was growing. He didn't want to stand the fact that some creature that was much stronger than Ro was trying to challenge her to a duel, and even with unequal forces. While Robert was preparing to attack the creature, right behind him stood Miss Chloe. She could not understand why he had interfered, and was now trying to defeat the spirit alone, as if he again wanted to receive universal glory and gratitude from all who stood in the hall. The creature didn't like the fact that Mr. Arthur interfered. It called him nasty and said that he was just a mage and always pretends to be a good citizen. These words really hurt the guy because he became even more aggressive. Arthur Robert has already stood in a comfortable stand for him. He was still saving his strength to properly pile on the spirit. He thought that for him it would be very easy, and for one blow, the creature will vaporize, and all in the hall can quietly leave it. Arthur was confident in himself, because although he was a mage of no higher than average level, he realized that no spirit cannot compare with the heir of the family Robert. The boy filled his power to the maximum, and now he had a small but very powerful energy sphere in his hands. Mr. Robert was about to attack, but suddenly he realized that the creature changed the direction of his attack. From this, all the confidence of the guy evaporated. From the fright, he was sick. He did not know what to do next, because he was ready for everything, but certainly not for this. Shards of glass flew at Arthur. The creature turned to him. It said that it knew it could not handle him, but it explained that it had a handle on Robert because it knew he had a weakness. Suddenly, in the shards of glass appeared familiar faces to Arthur, Cecilia Richard, Arthur Richard, and Mr. Keynes. The shards were smaller reflections of frightened people. Now Mr. Robert had to make a choice, namely who to save. This question struck Arthur even more. He thought the spirit was too mean. It was too much to choose between the people closest to him and the inhabitants who were not involved in the attack. Still, the choice had to be made. It was a coercive measure. Mr. Robert began to act. With one wave of his hand, he directed a stream of magical energy on the people that stood behind him. This technique guy used to put a shield on them. In an instant, all the panic of the guests disappeared. Now they were standing more confidently and were surprised. They said that Arthur was an amazing magician and thanked him. Now one problem was solved. The only thing left was to deal with the spirit that was still in the hall. Rose stood and watched it all indifferently. There was only one question in her mind. Why was Robert doing all this? Did he really want to get glory again, at the expense of this rescue, even though he was now in a very dangerous situation? Mr. Arthur himself stood and thought about what to do next while trying to take a break. Drops of sweat dripped from his forehead. The reception had taken too much energy from him. Suddenly the creature spoke to the guy. The spirit began to gloat. It took advantage of the fact that Arthur was powerless, and with the words that he would not be able to defend himself now because he didn't have enough mana, it stabbed one shard at the guy. The piece of glass hit Robert right in the chest. Cecilia and Noel, who had been watching the events, were stunned. They obviously didn't expect such a turn. Mr. Richard immediately began to call Arthur, and perhaps even wanted to approach him, but in his heart he knew that it could be dangerous. So did Miss Rowe Chloe, who also did not expect that the creature would decide to attack Arthur at a moment when he was exhausted. The girl did not know how to act now. She was paralyzed with surprise and shock. Arthur Rober was defeated. He realized that now there was little to help him. From the hellish pain of the guy fell to one knee, and covered with his hand, a large bleeding wound on his chest. It seems he was ready to accept his defeat. Rose's green eyes grew even larger as she watched the whole scene, as if disconnected from the world. Her attention was now fixed only on Arthur, and she didn't notice that a glass shard was flying at her. Suddenly the girl came to her senses. She realized that, in her position, to do something was useless, and Miss Chloe was ready to accept the same fate as Arthur. At this time, the spirit decided to remind her that this was no time to be distracted. Suddenly, for Roe, a tall male silhouette stood in front of her. He took his large hand on the girl's shoulder to deflect the full impact of the shard onto himself. Miss Chloe didn't have time to see who was standing in front of her now, but she was grateful for the man. Roe took her gaze slightly upwards. She saw that Mr. Keynes was standing in front of her. He raised his arm even higher to cover the girl for sure. Within seconds, a shard flew into his shoulder, and blood spurted from the wound that had just formed. Roe Chloe looked through the blow, from shock. She was afraid to look below at the wound, from which the blood was already spurting. Drops almost hit the girl's face, and she stood and tried to understand what had just happened. Suddenly, everything disappeared. There was nothing around Keynes and Roe, as if they were the only two left on this place, where recently there was a hell. The girl looked at the guy standing in front of her, then at his hand, which had been pierced by a shard. After a while, when everything was quiet, Mr. Keynes and Roe were sitting in the hall. The guy had already received medical help, and his wound had been treated, but the cut was large and deep, and his hand was still very painful. But Keynes tried to keep his optimism. He laughed at the spirit and said that it was too formidable. But in response from the girl, all he got was something incoherent. The boy looked her in the eye. He reminded her that if it hadn't been for him, she might have been hit by the shard, and for that, she could have said the minimum words of gratitude. But Roe didn't listen to him at all, because she still couldn't get away from the situation. The girl was as if in another universe. Before her eyes were eerie images of that creature, and the shard that could quietly end her life. Also, Miss Chloe could not forget the moment where Arthur was pierced through, and he, without much, lived his last seconds in parallel bleeding. He was a true hero, for instead of defending himself, he had given his shield to other people. Keynes tried to take the girl out for a dialogue, but soon he realized that she stupidly did not react to him. Because of this, the guy was worried. He asked his little girl if she was okay, hoping for a positive answer. But the girl was silent. This incident had completely broken her. She was like a porcelain doll. She was motionless and calm, and her mind as if it was turned off. She wanted to forget about everything that was imprinted in her memory. Her hand was shaking convulsively, and it felt as if it was doing it on its own, as if someone was controlling it. The spirit's mocking words began to echo in Roe's mind again. She wished it would end soon because it was unbearable to endure. Miss Chloe remembered how the spirit laughed and said that he thought the girl was strong. Then through the shards the mistress could see his smile in human form. He looked like a doll with a snide smile. He had no eyes and hair. It was more like a mannequin. She also remembered what the spirit looked like in the form of a ball that was made of glass shards and was burning with purple fire. At that moment, it was laughing and asking if the girl was afraid of it. At that moment, it was no less creepy. These images flashed before the girl's eyes like a flashback. After 2 images, she woke up and tried to understand what had just happened. She was as if in a trance, as if a spirit was trying to contact her. Roe was once again as if she was frozen. She was staring at one point with a dead stare and couldn't understand what she had just seen in front of her. She had never had this before. It seemed her magic was starting to develop. But the creature wasn't going to stop there and kept on saying that Roe had strong magic but still obeyed other people. The demon was clearly provoking the girl, seducing her with power and authority. But the evil creature miscalculated. Lady Chloe not just froze in place and listened to his provocative speeches, she was preparing to fight back, already collecting drops of her magical blood in the palms of her hands. Scarlet streams flowed from the girl's clenched fist. Meanwhile, the demon continued his humiliating and at the same time tempting speeches. He ironically called the mage girl a simpleton who ignores his power, does not use it to his advantage, and indulges others. The insidious demon had gotten what he wanted. The girl raised her green-brown eyes at him defiantly, then haughtily and resolutely asked who was afraid. It was clear Ro wasn't going to stand by and listen anymore. Extending her hands forward with blood dripping from them, Ro resolutely directed a stream of her mana at the demon. It was powerful. Any above-average level mage wouldn't let it go unchecked. Mentally, the girl promised to tear the demon to shreds if it craved it so much. And at this moment, Arthur Robert, as one of the capable mages, felt the presence of a very strong mana. He instantly realized that it was very dangerous and could lead to serious and unpredictable consequences. The guy decided that he needed to figure out what was going on his own. As he audited his body, he noted a small wound from the fight, but he was confident that he could handle everything without any problems. He stepped forward, shielding Ro from the demon with the words that he would handle everything on his own and she shouldn't interfere. But the girl wasn't thrilled with the unsolicited protection and asked the guy what he was doing. Mentally assuring himself that he would destroy the demon in one blow, Arthur brought his hands together, reciting one of the strongest spells known to him, and a ball of unbearably bright light began to form between his palms. A bright green stream of mana burst from Arthur's hands and rushed straight towards the evil demon, striking everyone present with the bursting light and the incredible power of the blow. Everyone knew of young Mr. Robert's abilities, but no one could have imagined that it would be so powerful in person. With a loud chime, the entire ballroom was filled with shards of greenish light, so bright and magical that it turned an ordinary, albeit luxurious, hall almost into a heavenly hall. This was the true power of Arthur Robert. Everyone around him froze in amazement, looking around. The amazed guests were showered with particles of stardust that came from the wave of mana Arthur had released. People marveled, saying that everything that was happening was amazing. However, Ro's reaction was drastically different from the others present. She was watching the mage with irritation that prevented her from smearing the demon on the wall. The girl scolded Arthur in her thoughts, regretting that she couldn't stop him in time and that annoying guy had interfered without permission. Ro watched the admiration of those around her with a disgruntled expression. The girl was clearly not thrilled with the current situation and with the magnificent Arthur, who heroically saved all the guests in the ballroom from the insidious and evil demon. Suddenly, a vision flashed in one of the shards of light that had almost disappeared. Ro saw someone's eyes staring intently right at her. A frightening and hissing voice spoke to her, and a wave of unpleasant and piercing goosebumps ran through her skin, as if she were being touched by something unnatural and dangerous. The evil creature, supposedly just destroyed by Arthur, advised Roha not to fall for the deception of people and not to let emotions into her heart, because it would be a pity if the girl lost her essence of a magician. The lady listened with an impenetrable expression to the final speeches of the one who had made an attempt on Cecilia's life. Finally, the last shard dissolved in space, and the demon, promising a farewell to the young Marquise Chloe to meet in the future, disappeared. Probably this creature was able to recognize in the girl what no one had ever noticed before. He saw Ro's ability to magic and what inhuman strength is contained in this small body. For Ro, the behavior of a dangerous creature that had appeared out of nowhere was extremely strange. The promise of a future meeting was exhilarating and a little frightening. In addition, his defiant speeches were deeply lodged in the girl's mind, not wanting to leave it. The young lady pensively escorted the disappearing demon with an unreadable look of her green-brown eyes. After the danger had passed, all the guests began to discuss what had just happened. Everyone praised Arthur Robert, who had saved the guests, but they soon turned their attention to Ro, who had demonstrated her mana to everyone here. The ladies and lords were lost in speculation. Was this young girl really a mage? Keynes also shared the general mood in the ballroom. He was truly delighted by the power of the mages. He watched with delight the brilliant pair of capable young mages who had managed to drive away the evil demon and protect all the guests invited to the ball. Arthur was clearly relieved that it was all over. He concluded that the demon had probably used the glass to get in here. And to avoid this happening again, they should remove all the glass in the manor. That way they would be safe. Roe remained silent, listening attentively to the boy's reasoning. Then Arthur turned his attention to Cecilia and asked her if she was all right. She replied with relief that she was not hurt, and in turn asked the boy if he was. Both of them were frightened by what had happened. Arthur said that the injury was nothing, and that she should not worry about his health, especially since he was going to seek help from a healer soon. Arthur then turned to Roe, asking if she was hurt. But Roe was not in the best mood. Unlike this pseudo-savior, she was well aware that it wasn't over yet. She irritably explained that the problem was not the injuries of both mages at all. The girl clenched her palm into a fist, thinking about what they should do next. Arthur hadn't been able to destroy the demon. He'd just driven it away, and it might well come back again soon and do things they couldn't handle. It was necessary to kill the evil creature while they had the chance. But the young man did not seem to take the girl's words seriously. He indulgently patted her on the shoulder, saying that the only thing that mattered now was that no one was seriously hurt, and he would deal with the monster later. Noticing that the girl was in no hurry to calm down, Arthur put his hand on Rose's shoulder and squeezed it lightly, trying to look into her eyes with care and even tenderness. The guy was a little discouraged by this reaction. The boy had hoped for recognition and admiration from such a young girl, though, as it turned out, she also had magical powers. After all, he had saved everyone and even got wounded during the incident. And Roe continued to frantically ponder over the situation. Her gaze lingered on Arthur's wound, and she realized once again that the lives of all present were hanging in the balance, and what had happened here would obviously continue. After a moment, the girl turned her back on Arthur for reasons he did not understand. Roe silently walked away, leaving the young man to speculate why she had left him so abruptly. He had hoped for recognition and admiration from such a young girl, though, as it turned out, she also had magical abilities. He had saved everyone and even got wounded during the incident. Panic slowly began to grow in the hall because it became clear to everyone that the criminal had not been captured, and it was getting dangerous. It seemed that the banquet was over. Many were sorry to leave. It was a royal ball after all, but life was more precious. Meanwhile, Keynes was sitting on the steps of one of the staircases and was dealing with his wounds, which he had received during his unsuccessful fight with the demon. He couldn't stop the blood no matter how much he tried, and Roe was on her way to Keynes. The girl approached the young man sitting on the stairs and asked him directly why he had interfered, because she had said she didn't need saving. Keynes replied with a chuckle that he had not known about Roe's abilities before. Roe looked at him defiantly and said that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself and that it was not necessary to interfere. The girl gave him a condescending and dismissive look that made him uncomfortable. But even after such a look, Keynes was not confused. He replied with unconcealed sarcasm and a snide smile that Roe's words were very hurtful, especially since he had not interfered for fun, but was worried about the girl. The young man also added that his body reacted to the situation much faster than his thoughts, and there was nothing he could do about it. Roe was about to start snapping at him again, but she didn't have time to say anything. Keynes suddenly asked the girl to give him her hand. Roe only had time to ask what he wanted it for before he grabbed her hand, where the cut from the glass, made by Lady Chloe herself to awaken the mana, was left, and stared at it, examining the wound. He took out a bandage and began to bandage the girl's wound, accompanying his actions with words to the effect that he knew that every mage had his own means of concentrating magic. The young man reasonably assumed that Rose was blood. The girl did not immediately understand what Keynes was getting at and asked him to clarify what he meant. In response, however, Keynes tried to make a sad joke about the little mage needing to hurt herself in order to do damage to her opponent. And really, what an irony. Once the wound was bandaged, Keynes informed Roja that he was done and advised her to seek the help of a healer when she returned to her place at Chloe's ancestral estate. This is necessary to ensure that no scar is left on the young lady's arm. The girl with mixed feelings watched everything that Keynes was doing. She didn't react to his words, just looked at him with a stare, as if trying to understand what was going on in his head. As soon as the young man realized that he would not wait for any answer from the girl, he smiled kindly and told Roya that it was time for him to leave, and once again asked Lady Chloe to treat the wound as soon as she returned home to her brother. As soon as Keynes got up from the stairs with a little effort, he headed for the exit, and Ro remained standing there, looking away from her with an indifferent expression, as if she didn't care at all about what was happening to Keynes. However, after just a moment, the girl's green-brown eyes widened in surprise because she noticed something that Lady Chloe could not leave without attention. The girl was suddenly overcome with emotion, the very emotions that the insidious demon had strongly advised her to avoid. She noticed that the wound on Keynes's shoulder was much more serious than her insignificant cut, and it was still bleeding. He'd just been so concerned to help her, worried about her, even about a possible scar, even though he was far from well. Ro pressed her lips together nervously at the influx of feelings she didn't understand. Was it compassion, or was it something else, even more unknown? The girl couldn't figure out what she should do now. Should she turn away indifferently and walk away, or should she ask Keynes about his injury? Unexpectedly, Ro decided to introduce herself to Keynes now, for they had not been introduced to each other before. She raised her big eyes to him and said her name with determination, Ro Chloe. It was probably the first step on the lady's part towards their possible friendship. Not quite understanding the girl's words, Keynes, who was about to bow out, turned to Ro and asked her about her name in a puzzled manner. In response, the girl repeated her name firmly and without a trace of embarrassment, still looking her interlocutor straight in the eyes. The boy smilingly thanked the lady for telling him her name and also promised that he would remember it and next time he would address Roja in a proper manner, not as he had done before. And then Keynes finally understood. He froze in amazement for a moment, trying to realize the name he had just heard. Was the bride his brother had arranged to marry really the same name as the little lady Mage he had rescued at the feast in the city? Just then, the head of the Rodriguez clan, Keynes' older brother, appeared out of nowhere. It looked like he was invited to the ball too, but he decided to show up only now. The boy hurried over to the couple talking and called out to Keynes. The young man turned to his brother and was surprised at his sudden appearance. Isaac was then surprised when he noticed that his brother was being spoken to by none other than Ro Chloe, who was known to both of them. The young man asked Keynes if he had managed to make an acquaintance with Miss Ro, his future bride. But even after these words, Keynes did not guess how his brother knew the little Mage. The young man asked his brother in surprise what he meant about Ro and how he knew the girl. This situation was quite comical, especially since none of those present understood the essence of what was going on. It wasn't the first time Isaac was embarrassed by his brother's behavior. The head of the Rodriguez family looked away, apologizing to Lady Chloe for Keynes's lack of etiquette towards the young Marquise, and for the fact that he failed to properly educate his younger brother, thanks to which Isaac has to blush for him. The boy extended his hand, clad in snow-white man's gloves towards the young lady, with the words that now he would introduce them to each other officially, so that such confusing situations would not arise again. Isaac pointed at the girl and happily informed his brother that this was Ro Chloe, his current bride and future wife. Keynes didn't immediately understand the meaning of his words, just as he had when the head of the Rodriguez family had informed his brother of his engagement. His brown eyes widened in amazement, and 1,000 thoughts were rushing through his mind. This girl whom he had never missed an opportunity to tease, who possessed magical abilities that even delighted him, suddenly turned out to be an unknown bride imposed by his brother. Meanwhile, the white-haired girl who had so closely watched Cecilia and Arthur, who had been talking peacefully before the dangerous creature appeared, stood in a quiet and hidden place from human eyes. This insidious stranger was talking to someone about not expecting a second mage to appear next to Cecilia. And strangely enough, despite her loneliness, the young schemer received a clear answer that came from the elegant folding mirror in her hands. The unknown man fervently excused himself, asking what they should do now, because he also did not expect that there would be 2 mages at the ball. The direction of the conversation made the white-haired villainess angry. She threw the unfortunate mirror against the floor with force, muttering furiously to shut up, because he was the one who had to do everything properly. The mirror shattered at the girl's feet with a piercing ringing sound, splashing in different directions with sharp edges of shards. The voice of the mysterious interlocutor of the white-haired stranger stopped abruptly, and a ringing silence reigned in the corridor. The girl in the black dress turned away sharply and resolutely followed the dark corridor along the many closed doors of this secluded wing of the castle. The expression on the white-haired girl's face did not bode well for those who had made her so angry. Outside the window, the summer weather was beautiful. The snow-white palace where someone's screams were coming from was reflecting the sunlight. "Brother, think to yourself, can this really be called an engagement?" A man's voice cut the ears of everyone in the vicinity. "She's only 15. The man's shout grew louder and louder. The room from which it was coming seemed to be shaking, and the blue doors, with their black trim and yellow inserts, were barely holding. "There's an 8-year age difference between me and her. This is a crime." Keynes in his white suit shouted at his brother, who at this time was sitting peacefully, smiling slightly, calmly enduring his exclamations. At 15, it was already official to be engaged. The man who was sitting in the chair finally answered him. In between, he lightly fixed his hair with the back of his hand, still smiling a little tautly. "And why are we already engaged? You married for love. Why should I have an arranged marriage?" Keynes did not lower his tone during the whole dialogue. He was clearly pissed off by the situation. "Calm down. You are only engaged. Even if you marry, Lady Roja must first turn 18. The red-eyed brunette replied in a more balanced tone, though the heat of the situation didn't change. "But even 18 is too young, and she's 15 now. Moreover, she's the only daughter of Marquis Chloe." The boy sat down carelessly on the sofa and continued in a disgruntled tone. "Her family has nothing to regret. Usually at this age they already start looking for an heir to an aristocratic family." His body was gradually calming down, and he was now rather passive-aggressive. "But she's a mage. Her father surely wants to give his daughter to someone like me?" He leaned his hand on his head tiredly, rubbing his bangs carelessly. "Still, there are many strange things about this engagement, no matter how you look at it." Keynes's brother clenched his fists and spoke through gritted teeth. "I admit that with her help, I want to establish relations with Marquis Chloe, but this is a measure for political reasons." His body tensed, and his voice became much more hostile. "If what I fear does not happen, the engagement can be broken off." The man, finally finished speaking, settled back in his chair. "What will become of that girl?" Keynes exclaimed worriedly. "I'm sorry for her, but the engagement will be broken off and she'll be auctioned off again," the boy replied, looking away awkwardly, a little embarrassed by his brother's question. "So, you want to use her for political purposes and then throw her away?" Keynes looked a little disappointed at his interlocutor, who didn't seem particularly puzzled by such things. Hearing the accusations, the man immediately began to explain himself. "It doesn't have to be like this. It is necessary for me as the head of the clan." The red-eyed man got up from the couch and walked towards the door, throwing one last time. "Enough excuses. I understand the situation. We'll talk about the rest later." "Where are you going?" his interlocutor asked him. "I'm going to work," Keynes answered briefly, walking briskly across the sunlit room to the massive door. There was expensive blue furniture with gold embroidery all around the room. "Wait a minute. Do you work on the weekends?" The guy still sitting in the chair was very surprised at such words, clearly not expecting such a thing from his brother. His bangs were slightly out of his back-combed hairstyle, covering his surprised eyebrows. Keynes opened the door, putting on his knight's uniform on the way, and answering his interlocutor. "This is an order of the order. It is necessary to find out who ruined the banquet." With one last look at his brother, he left the room. It was still the same bright, sunny day. This time, the sun was illuminating the red-haired girl's snow-white estate. Green hills and flowering gardens could be seen behind the building. The purple roof reflected the light. The beautiful Roe lay plastered on the wide bed, not daring to move in any direction. Her red hair scattered carelessly over the black pillow and the red blanket she had chosen to cover herself with. The girl stared tiredly at the high ceilings, her hand resting carelessly on her forehead, closing her amber eyes against the bright morning glow of the sun. "I've been up all night," she thought, sighing deeply. "I kept thinking about the same thing, the image of a golden-haired boy whose chest had been pierced by a quick, bluish, magical beam flashed through her memories. She remembered the blood that spurted from him, as well as his face when he was nearly stabbed through. When I was in danger, Keynes protected me with his back, even though he got hurt afterward. At that moment, the guy abruptly leaned Roe against him, not leaving the beam any chance to harm her even slightly. She remembered that she never answered the mage's question. "Are you afraid?" A seemingly simple question. But the girl froze, not knowing what to say. Her amber eyes were wide open and her body tensed. "But still, why couldn't I answer anything?" pondered the girl, rolling over in the bed from one side to the other. She was sufficiently angry with herself. She clenched her fist tightly, frowned her eyebrows, and her gaze became sharper. "Fear? No, I can't experience such a thing, can I?" the red-haired lady thought as she lay in bed, her lips tightly pressed together in a thin line. Her bangs carelessly spread all over her face, and the rest of her strands were scattered all over the bed. "This is a low emotion for the weak and inferior," thought the girl. "I have always tried to protect myself, even if it meant destroying an entire crowd with magic, but I have never experienced fear and similar feelings. On the contrary, those who found themselves before me were afraid. What's happening to me? What is this strange, unpleasant feeling?" The girl got up from the pillows and began to shake her head aggressively, as if it would make the feeling go away like a headache. "We have to find this black glass magician," firmly decided the red-haired girl, looking at the front door. "Only this way I will be able to answer all the questions that interest me." The lady continued her thought. A small face of a maid appeared in the doorway. Noticing that the lady was awake, she quickly entered the room and bowed. "Lady, are you awake early?" the blue-eyed girl asked in an agitated voice. The girl getting up from the bed ordered, "Betty, get everything ready for the trip." "So early?" the girl with brown hair asked her uncertainly. "Yes, of course," the red-haired lady answered her. "Wait, but where are you going?" the maid asked anxiously, trying to keep an imaginary calmness on her face. But her companion was also a little surprised by this question, because she had not worked out the plan in detail. Finally, turning to the blue-eyed girl, the red-haired lady said, frightened, "I don't know." Her voice was not confident at all, but rather timid, confused. It complemented her innocent image in her night pajamas. "I need to find a person where I should go?" Mistress asked her interlocutor. "If you need to find someone, perhaps seek the help of Mr. Leston." After a bit of thought, the maid answered her. As always, her brother's emotionless voice suddenly came to mind. "Contact me if you need help." This dialogue passed not so long ago, therefore the girl remembered it perfectly. That day, his always cold and steely voice had suddenly warmed for a moment, but Ro didn't want to trust him, let alone ask for help. She looked sternly at the blue-eyed maid, who was a little embarrassed by such a direct gaze. "I wouldn't want that," the red-haired girl finally said. That same day, somewhere not far from Chloe's estate stood a white and yellow palace with snow-white columns. The building was quite tall and luxurious. In one of the rooms, Arthur's voice sounded. "Hello, Cecilia. Noel." "Arthur, how are you feeling?" the blonde asked worriedly. "You're looking pretty good," added her brother, who smiled encouragingly at the golden-haired boy. "I was healed by a servant who knows how to use healing magic." "Cecilia, are you all right?" Arthur asked softly. The girl looked away from his blue eyes with regret. "Yes, but I've caused so many people to get hurt. I feel kind of bad that the culprit still hasn't been caught," the blonde said embarrassedly. Arthur replied in a soothing tone, "Don't worry, a request for help has come from the Night Order. She would surely be caught soon." He wanted to believe, with his sunny aura, the man's mere presence made the atmosphere better. There were desserts on the table, cookies, cakes, pastries. There was also a porcelain blue and white service. Green tea was poured into a jug, which easily reflected all the sunlight penetrating into the room. "Is it the same person?" Suddenly, the blonde woman spoke. Awkwardly sipping her tea, the girl continued. "Last time I was pushed into the river, and now this mage with glass has appeared. Are these things coincidences?" The blonde stopped her gaze on the mug of tea, avoiding the gazes of the others. "Perhaps they are," Arthur agreed, shaking his head positively. "But that's just weird. If the culprit is a mage, why, when he attempted to kill Cecilia the first time, did he just push her into the water? It would have been much easier to accomplish his purpose if he had used magic where there were few people." Noel objected. I hate to think about it, but it's quite possible that Cecilia is being attacked by two different people, Arthur said thoughtfully, staring with golden eyes at a vague point on the table. During the ball, Ro came up to me and said that some ladies were speaking ill of you, and you could hear everything. She asked if I could comfort you. Awkwardly translating his gaze, Noel said, I think I know who you are talking about. Cecilia replied. She looked at Noel with a puzzled look and continued, but I wasn't hurt by what those ladies said. I was just looking for Ro and happened to come to a remote corner, but I thought there was no point in contacting them. After thinking for a bit, the blonde's brother replied, maybe those gossipy girls are the culprits? What if they hired a mage to hurt you? Noel turned to his sister, asking what she thought about it. The girl put a hand to her face, and after a couple seconds of thought, the girl answered, shrugging her shoulders. I don't. I know those ladies. They just like to spread rumors, but they would never kill. By the way, it's so amazing that Ro was worried about me. Cecilia's cheeks faintly blushed at the thought of Ro's concern. How touching that she asked to comfort me, and then saved me, the blonde exclaimed. The golden-haired man's gaze dimmed and his head slumped down. It seems Ro is slowly beginning to understand the feelings of the people around her, except if one but overrode the good news. Her magic was amazing. The blonde man's voice rang out. Yes, she was amazing, the girl exclaimed excitedly, looking at Noel. Only Arthur replied coldly and dryly, sipping his tea. Yes, that's right. Arthur, even you can't beat her, said Noel, smirking. You will definitely lose. I'm sure of it. Cecilia's laughing voice rang out. What does it matter if I win or not? The golden-haired boy asked indifferently, rolling his eyes. It's very important. A shout rang out in unison. Laughing awkwardly through force at his friend's banter, Arthur went back to thinking about the red-haired girl. The most important thing is that I found out one fact, the guy with the golden hair thought. He remembered the moment from the banquet where the girl with eyes full of disgust said, I should have killed him. Ro is capable of killing a person. She has tremendous power, so she can do it if she wants to. The girl's magic was staggeringly great. The level she showed at the banquet was almost impossible. If I didn't interfere with her, innocent people might have gotten hurt because of her magic, Arthur thought. Once her title as a dangerous mage is solidified, her life will become unbearable. She would become a bloody, dangerous, and ruthless mage. She will have to hide in the slums, and more likely than not, the people closest to her will abandon her, because with such a bad reputation, she will be an easy target for attack. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. It was a brunette servant who entered the spacious room, immediately walking closer to the wooden table where his master and two guests were seated. The servant bowed to the golden-haired man, addressing him. Mr. Robert, you have a guest to see you. In bewilderment, Arthur even jumped up from his chair. A guest, but who could it be? I wasn't expecting anyone else, the man stated firmly. The brunette replied, This is Lady Ro Chloe. The man with yellow eyes was greatly surprised. Did Ro really come here? He asked in bewilderment. His bangs fell a little carelessly over his high-raised eyebrows. When Mr. Robert went to the entrance of the manor to meet Lady Chloe, the girl was just getting out of the carriage. The carriage had gotten her here quite quickly, for which she was to be commended. The sun was shining brightly outside. A red-haired girl in a black hat entered the large hall. Everyone present was surprised by her sudden visit. The girl explained some details, saying that she had come because she wanted to talk. Noel and Cecilia, who were sitting at the table, turned to look at Ro. Noel said that it was good of Ro to come because they were wondering who would win if. Before the boy could finish, Cecilia shut his mouth, telling him to be quiet. Then she asked how Lady Chloe was feeling. Cecilia continued. She said that Arthur was already fully recovered and that Noel was not worth paying any attention to, but in fact, the blonde-haired mage was not fully recovered, and Noel was angry at not being listened to. The ash-haired Lady Richard smiled radiantly, looking directly at the newly arrived Ro Chloe. The girl said that she was very touched, and she wasn't the least bit hurt by the words that had come from the other ladies that day. It took the red-haired girl some time to realize what Lady Richard was talking about. All she could think about now was the incident and the glass mage, and there was no room in her head for gossip. Arthur invited the girl to sit down at the table and offered to pour her tea. The smile never left his lips as he said this. Ro pushed back her chair and sat down at the table just as the mage had said. The blonde-haired man went to fetch the teapot. A couple minutes later, there was a cup of fresh hot tea on the table, It was scented with herbs and mint and tasted refreshing despite the temperature. There were 3 more cups on the table, but they were all half empty. The mage turned to the girl, asking if she wanted to talk about that glass mage. Wasn't that what she had come here for today? Let's be honest, this man was very good at reading the intentions of others, so it wasn't hard for him to figure out what was on Ro's mind. The girl, without thinking, asked where she could find that mage. Her face didn't express any emotion. She focused her gaze at one point and kept looking there, waiting for an answer. Her eyes were wide open. Arthur Robert assured the girl that there was no need to worry, as the knightly order together with his family had already agreed on a joint search. The girl interrupted him, saying she wanted to find the culprit first. The blonde-haired man looked at Ro with a serious expression and asked if there was any particular reason why she wanted him to knight ya. Still, looking at this girl's magic power, letting her catch the culprit first wasn't the best idea. Realizing how strange her last words sounded, the girl went on to say that the man had attacked her on his own. Did she need a reason to find the person who tried to kill her? The girl became perplexed. The young man confirmed her words that there was no reason not to look for the one who had tried to kill. He interjected, were those factors really the only ones driving her? Arthur looked away. Marquis Chloe's daughter froze in a stupor, pondering if it was really one single reason and nothing else was driving her. Her gaze, which already seemed lifeless, darkened even more. Ro turned her head sharply. Ro clutched the hem of her red dress with considerable strength. She hesitated. Her mind was once again filled with that intolerable and endless stream of thoughts and memories. She hesitantly answered yes after a long time. The young man turned his back to her and mumbled something quiet enough that she couldn't hear it. He wasn't pleased that she was going to take her revenge alone. Arthur exhaled heavily and turned his head again. Ro had said that was why she had come here today. Her only desire was to find out a way to find the glass mage. She stared intently at the mage, but her voice didn't sound too harsh, so the situation didn't get heated. The young man listened to the question. He looked down, not taking his eyes off the cup of tea on the table in front of him. He pondered over the best course of action, whether it was right to share the information. The mage knew the girl could hurt someone. Meanwhile, the brother and sister were whispering. Cecilia talked about how it wasn't a bad thing, as Ro was very strong. Noel supported her, saying that Ro inspires more confidence than Arthur. These two were on the girl's side. They said in one voice that Arthur could be by Ro's side to prevent danger. Hearing this, the young man suddenly realized something and raised his head. Now he was sure of his decision and no longer hesitated. The mage stared ahead of him for a while longer, beginning to doubt his decision again. His green eyes were clouded with darkness and uncertainty. Arthur did not know what to do. What was the right thing to do? Then he still said that the emperor had already issued a decree and there was a request for the cooperation of the knightly order. As the heir of the Robert family, he couldn't act only at the request of the red-haired woman. Hearing this, her eyebrows came down to the bridge of her nose. But after a brief pause, he added that if she agreed to participate in the investigation, he could help her. A smile shone on the mage's face as he looked at Ro sitting in front of him and waited for her answer, hoping that she would be satisfied with his terms. It made the young man a little uneasy, but he could still stop Ro from going down the crooked path. They immediately set out on the road. After a while, the two mages reached the Alley Mage family's estate. They stood in front of a majestic building. While Ro was looking at the manor with rapt attention, Arthur said that Viscountess Oriana Alley uses time for her magic. She could help them find a clue in the past or future. After saying that, they moved forward towards the entrance. The girl hesitated for a moment. She didn't know it was possible to know the future so easily. After hearing about this ability of Oriana Alley, the red-haired girl was worried if this woman could see the terrible events that would happen because of Ro. Arthur continued to talk about the Viscountess. According to him, she was 500 years old. When they entered the manor, the inner structure seemed to the girl not as grand as she expected. From the outside, the structure was distinguished by its incredible beauty, but from the inside, it looked more like an ordinary house. A woman's voice was heard, greeting her companions. A girl with black hair, dressed in a black dress and long gloves, came out to greet them. She said that it had been a long time since they had seen Mr. Robert. This woman really didn't look 500 years old. Viscountess Oriana Alley was the head of the Alley family. She didn't age, so her appearance was beautiful, long black hair and gray-purple eyes. The woman had earrings with precious stones in her ears and a necklace of pearls around her neck. Arthur thanked her for accepting them despite the suddenness of the visit. The young man was not at all surprised by her appearance, as he had met Oriana before. Ro, on the other hand, was very surprised. She couldn't believe that this woman was so old. The woman in black replied that when it came to mages, she was always willing to help, and remarked that he didn't come alone today, pointing to the red-haired girl standing next to Arthur. Ro stepped a step forward. The girl decided she needed to introduce herself. She said her name was Ro Chloe. Her eyes were still wide open, either from shock and inability to accept that the Viscountess was not as young as she seemed, or from fear of revealing secrets of the future. The woman smiled, squinting her eyes. She said that Ro had such a bright look in her eyes, calling her a lovely lady. She definitely liked the girl. That smile softened things a bit, and the atmosphere in the room became favorable again. The Viscountess took out a deck of cards, the backs of which were decorated with silver. She said that the cards would reveal why they had come. The woman began shuffling the deck in her hands. The rustling of the cards filled the quiet room. The two mages froze in anticipation. Then she spread them out on the table with a flick of her hand. A dark purple glow began to emanate from the cards. Oriana told them to pick 3 cards, thinking about her question. It was one way to find out about the near future. Arthur sat back, looking at Ro, thus giving her a chance to be the first to draw a card. The girl looked at him questioningly, pointing a finger at herself as if to ask if he was sure he wanted her to ask the question. After thinking for a bit, she reached for the card spread out on the table. The girl was still hesitating, not knowing which card to choose. If the future or the past somehow depended on that choice, it was a daunting task. Ro poked her finger at one of the cards, then turned it over at the Viscountess's request. This was repeated 2 more times. 3 cards were required to put the complete picture together. Only 3. That was enough. There were now 3 upside-down cards on the table in front of her. They were the older arcana of the tarot, the moon, the devil, and the tower. The moon usually represented envy, the devil meant manipulation, and the tower was a card of life's troubles and something unforeseen. The Viscountess examined the cards and held her hand over them with magic power accumulated in it. She smiled and said, it made sense to her now. It didn't seem complicated, but in reality it took a lot of effort to decipher the cards. Ro was perplexed. She looked questioningly at the woman who never said anything. The girl had no idea what she could learn from the 3 cards, for she did not know how to decipher tarot predictions. Viscountess Oriana Alley said she understood what had happened to their friend Cecilia. She had hit the point exactly. This woman was not a charlatan, for no one had mentioned before that anything had happened to Lady Richard. The woman's voice became unsure. She was quietly wailing about what to do. Finding an answer to Lady Rose's question was very difficult. There was silence in the room after these words. The 2 mages heeded the Viscountess's every word. After a few moments, the red-haired girl asked why the answer was so difficult to find. A look of bewilderment appeared on her face. She had already believed that this woman could find out anything she wanted to know. Oriana Alley began to interpret each card in context. In this case, the moon meant that the man was hiding his whereabouts. The woman said that he has unusual abilities and can move outside of reality, for example, using glass or mirrors. Arthur confirmed her speculation by saying that this mage uses glass, all true. Oriana added, to be more precise, he used the reflection property. Ro clarified that the peculiarity of such mages was that they did not show themselves. Such mages usually hid in the darkness and displayed the dark sides of others, just like the mirror in the fairy tale of Snow White. The parallel with the fairy tale was quite appropriate because there was something similar with reflection magic and distortion of facts. Arthur didn't understand what Oriana meant and asked if she was talking about the Queen's mirror. The woman replied that that mirror fueled the Queen's feelings of inferiority and caused her to kill Snow White. It controlled her actions. Ro thought, so the real villain in the fairy tale was the mirror, not the Queen. In their case, Cecilia was the Queen, in which case, who was the mirror? Meanwhile, the woman in black laid another card on the table. It was the card of the devil. The woman continued. In the place of the Queen was the wish card. She was pointing to a lady their age. This lady would pour out her repressed desires to the magician in the mirror. Now the big picture of what was happening began to emerge in the minds of those present. She also added that it seemed that the incident at the lake was also caused by a wish whispered by the demon. The one who commanded the mirrors used the poor girl as his puppet and was not ashamed of his actions. Arthur hypothesized, saying that it was the queen who pushed Cecilia into the water, and the mirror mage was the one who broke the window. In his eyes, they seemed like accomplices. The young man furrowed his eyebrows and listened intently to the woman. Ro wasn't left out of the discussion either. She speculated that if they couldn't find the mage from the mirror, could they find the queen outside of it? Her guess seemed quite reasonable. Hope sparkled in the girl's eyes. The fortune-teller touched her chin with her knuckle as if thinking about something, and then said it was hard to know the exact location, but her emotions might be a clue. That was the only clue so far. This girl must be experiencing very negative feelings, like anger, resentment, jealousy, feelings of inferiority, and of the positive ones, only benevolence towards them. It seemed to contradict each other. Arthur thought he had misheard. The young man asked again just in case, not anger, but benevolence? How could it even be that a person would try to kill another not out of spite, but only out of benevolence? Oriana Alley said she thought the feeling was close to an obsession with something you can't get. It seemed to her that that girl was unrequitedly in love with Arthur, which was why she was acting in such a strange way. The fortune-teller asked if Mr. Robert had any idea who it might be. She looked intently at the young man, waiting for an answer. He thought for a moment and said he had no idea who it could be. Ro remembered the day of the banquet. It had been so crowded that everyone there could have been a suspect. Everyone was so beautifully dressed that day for the occasion, and how could something like that happen? The girl said that there were too many pretenders to be the culprit. Analyzing the situation again, Oriana agreed with Lady Chloe's words. The criminal could easily get lost in the crowd or not even be seen by them. Arthur Robert sat in confusion. He said it was because the banquet was so crowded that they were having such a hard time narrowing down the suspects. The investigation was at a standstill again. It seemed like nothing would change, and they would never find out who the glass mage was. Ro thought for a moment, then lowered her eyes and said she should think simpler. She had an idea in her head that she wasn't 100% sure she was right about, so she hesitated to voice it. Arthur and Oriana looked at the girl, waiting for her to continue speaking. Both were very interested in the course of her thoughts. What was Chloe's swarm coming up with this time? How was she going to think simpler and find the culprit? The girl raised her head and said confidently, putting her hand on her breast, that if the queen had committed a crime against Cecilia out of jealousy, then Ro might become Arthur's lover. It made sense, for if Ro became the bait, she could catch the glass mage. Ro lowered her gaze down in thought. She pushed aside all the complicated thoughts and said that it was worth thinking much simpler, and the clue to how to catch the dark mage might be on the surface of the thoughts. Artru and Mrs. Alley looked questioningly at the girl. They did not understand what she meant by the suggestion to think simpler. Besides, she said it very mysteriously, so it was not clear what she wanted to convey to the subscribers. The girl pointed with her hand and explained that if the queen had committed a crime against Cecilia out of jealousy, then she could become Arthur's lover. That was what she meant by the idea of thinking more simply. These words surprised Mr. Robert very much. He questioned the mistress if she was sure that she wanted to become a decoy for the dark magician, because it was quite dangerous and risky for the girl, especially after the situation at the ball. Oriana smiled at Ro's words. She said that the girl was very clever for suggesting not to look for the queen, but just to make her come directly into their hands. Yes, to the woman, the idea seemed risky too, but it was the only easy way out of the situation. Miss Chloe explained that if she just danced with Arthur at some ball, the queen would definitely try to attack her. But Mr. Robert kept saying that the idea was dangerous and he wasn't very supportive. Miss Alley supported Mr. Robert and said that the lady should be careful because the magician in the mirror is the kind of person whose criminal tendencies are stronger than even the instinct of self-preservation, and it can be very dangerous to fight with such a cruel monster. The fact that everyone was worried Ro was quite cold-blooded, she said that it did not matter. After all, she is still stronger. Arthur, who was standing next to her, was still angry. He tried to tell the girl that this was not a good way. Miss Chloe didn't listen to the guy. She said that there was no good way to find out the whereabouts of the mage anymore, and if Robert might have something in mind, let him share it. The guy started talking about a lead, and that it was better to get the knightly order involved and take action. At this time, the Viscountess began to behave very strangely. She smiled stupidly and nervously waved her hands to the side, and then said that she knew nothing about it, as if she was hiding something from her guests. Her behavior was alarming. Ro was tired of debating. She shifted her gaze to the cards that were still lying in front of her. With her fragile finger, she pointed to the tower. It was the last card in the layout. The woman hadn't said a word about it the whole time. She had revealed the essence of the past two cards, but she hadn't touched on this one. Ro asked Oriana why she hadn't said anything about this last card. The woman began to explain that the card showed the result of actions, and if she interpreted it, it wouldn't be very interesting. The Viscountess also added that the future the card showed depended on how her guests interpreted it, which made Ro wonder, and she asked if Miss Allie could predict the future, so it was predetermined. A mysterious smile appeared on the tarologist's face. She put her hand to her chin and replied that it all depended on how the companions felt about it. Now it was clear that the woman obviously didn't want to say anything to the end. The Viscountess explained that there is good and evil on all maps, and if we take the tower specifically, the destruction on it is just destruction, and usually people themselves define it as something extremely negative. The woman also added that whether a card would bring good or bad changes was up to the individual, which meant that the cards were only interpreted the way the person wanted them to be interpreted. These words made Ro think, because it turned out that from some side cards were just papers and could not always help a person. It all depended on how they are perceived and what answer want to see questioners to them. Abruptly, Miss Chloe got up from the table and said that since all the important questions had been asked, the meeting could be ended and they could go in search of the criminal. Such an action on the part of the girl was so abrupt that it made Arthur very surprised. Mr. Robert even at first did not believe his ears. He asked the girl what she said and looked at the Viscountess. She in turn laughed. She thought that Ro was joking and therefore called her funny. But both interlocutors realized that now it was better to let the girl go, so they let her leave the hall quietly. Mr. Arthur showed a desire to be alone with Oriana, so he decided to stay a little longer. The woman did not mind. She laughed once more at how the little one couldn't wait to get things sorted out sooner and get on with the process. Next, Miss Allie asked Robert why he wanted to be alone. The man explained that he had a question about Ro. This puzzled the Viscountess. She couldn't understand why Arthur wanted to bring up this particular subject. Next, the boy hesitantly asked if the woman knew anything about blood magic. This question sounded even stranger. Mrs. Allie looked at the boy cautiously, and he in turn told her that Ro's mother was a mage. But unfortunately, she had left this world very early, and perhaps that was why the girl had not had the opportunity to learn emotions. As far as he could tell, her magic was above the level of a teenager. She had no teachers, but her technique and reaction speed were incredible. The strangest thing was that Arthur had tried to find information about Roy and her mother, but there was nothing about their family anywhere. There was also no mention of blood magic in the ancient manuscripts, and so Mr. Robert hoped for Oriana. The woman replied that of course she knew about this ancient magic, but the last person to use it was someone whose name the lady did not want to reveal. Miss Allie asked the boy why he was so interested in this subject, because it was quite specific, and since nothing had been written about it in the sources before, it meant that almost no one had ever been interested in it before, which led to the conclusion that Arthur was the first. The guy explained that he was very worried about his friend because she was beginning to show emotions, and because of the fact that the girl almost always had a hostile attitude, it could lead her to something not very good. The master stood and looked out at the window where Ro was still visible. She was thinking how to get out of the place where she was now. Without taking his eyes off her, the guy said that in turn to stop the girl if something went wrong. Arthur added that when mages begin to feel emotions, they can often be ashamed of it, because for them it is a novelty, and therefore the confusion of Miss Chloe was a natural process for her, and most likely she will soon get used to it, and will behave as before, only more emotional. At these words, the woman looked at Mr. Robert a little haughtily. She explained that his plans to stop Miss Chloe in case of anything sounded too presumptuous, and there was a great risk that they might fail. The boy didn't understand the woman. His thought of stopping Ro in case of anything seemed like a very good idea, but after Oriana told him that it sounded presumptuous, he hesitated. Mr. Arthur interrogated the Viscountess as to what she meant, in a way that even after a while he couldn't understand her. Mrs. Alley explained that even if something happened to Miss Chloe, she herself must go through these trials, because only then would she be able to properly unleash her power, for the girl was not a disaster that needed to be stopped. These words made Arthur completely rethink everything. He realized that all this time he considered his friend dangerous and saw in her only that can only hurt others. The guy realized that the girl, on the contrary, should give freedom and trust her that she can calmly control herself. The woman advised Robert that he should look more carefully at himself if he has a lot of doubts about Ro. Perhaps the problem was that it was not Miss Chloe was the cause of doubts, but Arthur himself. Such a thought on the part of the woman made the boy think even more. He realized that the words of Viscountess Alley were true, and Mr. Arthur was not worried about Miss Ro at all. Hence, he had another question in his mind. What was the anxiety that constantly haunted him and all the time did not give him peace? Perhaps it was the fear that society might reject her. Mr. Robert remembered how as a child he was often not accepted normally because he had magical powers. These memories left a trace of Arthur beginning to feel pathetic. He had only wanted to be a good friend and mentor to Ro, but in the end he had suspected the girl of being dangerous because of his own insecurities, and without realizing it, he had sided with those who feared mages who were endowed with powerful powers. From the realization of the whole situation, Arthur became insanely ashamed. He did not really want to show it to the Viscountess, so silently clenched his hand into a fist, trying to pour all the emotions into this action. But the guy understood that now he had better think about what to do when he was able to, at least a little bit, to understand his emotions. The easiest option in Robert's mind was to finally stop judging and suspecting others, and just trust Roa that she could control herself and wouldn't hurt anyone, because even though she was only 15, she was more aware and wiser than the rest of her peers. All the time while the boy's mind was rethinking the situation and began the deepest excavations in himself, he stood silently and looked at the Viscountess of Alley. Against this background, the woman was a little upset and thought that she could not help Arthur, and unfortunately all her words were in vain. But Robert refuted this. He came out of the cocoon of his gloomy thoughts, and with a grateful smile said that on the contrary, everything had finally cleared up in his head, and he had done the right thing to confide in Mrs. Alley. But it was already time for him to go, and so they began to say goodbye. Miss Oriana crossed her arms and exhaled and asked Mr. Robert to come to her more often, because old people like her like to be visited without reason, and she was lonely in her estate. So when someone came to her, she was glad. Arthur smiled and promised that he would try to visit the Viscountess Alley more often. They stood together a little longer, and then the boy left. He ran quickly to Roya, who was waiting for him downstairs. He was afraid that the girl had been waiting for him for a long time, and after a while she might get tired of waiting and might leave on her own. Mr. Robert left the room in which he thought he had been talking to Oriana long enough. In seconds he ran up the stairs to Miss Chloe and inquired solicitously whether she had waited long for him, but in reply the girl only asked where they were going now. The boy was a little pleased that Ro was not angry at him for keeping her waiting. He said that now they had better make a plan of further action and that he would arrange to meet Noel. In response, Ro told Arthur that she was to become his lover as a decoy for the queen, and that he would not stop her from doing so. The girl confirmed her desire by saying that she had come to participate in the search and had every right to do so. Surprisingly for Miss Chloe, this time Robert agreed. She even thought at first that he was joking, but when her friend asked her to act out a scene of the lovers on the basis of which they could understand what they would have to face, all doubts about whether he would agree fell away. Ro wanted to ask why suddenly Mr. Arthur decided to agree to this adventure, because a couple of hours ago he would have been strongly opposed to it and considered the idea as dangerous and crazy as possible, and because of this, he was constantly trying to dissuade the girl to try it. The guy smiled slightly in response and explained that he and Ro were friends, and it was normal that he believed her, that even such a specific way could be the most effective way to solve the problem, and that perhaps it was not so dangerous if you remember that the lady had magic. The Viscountess of Alley was watching the small but very warm dialogue between the boys with great interest all the time, watching Roe and Arthur leaving her plot. The woman thought that their story was very interesting, especially if you look back at the past and the fate of their ancestors. Oriana was interested in Roe, who was a blood mage. It was incomprehensible to her how that person, who comes into action after people begin to have feelings in the depths of not his soul, was near Arthur. Arthur Robert embodied the symbol of good. He was the heir of a famous bloodline mage, and Roe Chloe was his complete opposite. She was like a symbol of evil from a bloodline mage whose name had been erased from history. The mage, who has not yet been released, unfortunately has to repeat his tragic fate, but I wonder if Roe and Arthur will be able to escape the intense grief and predecessors and somehow influence their future. Even in the middle of the day, the harbor part of the city seemed to be drowning in the shadows of the frequent buildings, and here and there were piles of crates with some kind of cargo. There were voices in the alleys, one complaining that they had no leads and that their search was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. It turned out to be Arthur and Noel walking along the cobblestone road past the harbor buildings, talking in low voices. The sound of their footsteps on the slabs of the road echoed through the neighborhood, but it was hardly disturbing to anyone. Not a soul was around. The black-haired boy asked his companion without much enthusiasm how they could find the one who had ruined the banquet, knowing only that he was a mage. The white-haired man said that today they had received news that a man would be sent from the Robert family, which would definitely help them. Keynes agreed that an assistant coming from the Robert family could be useful, but the young man doubted whether it was really worth meeting with this sent assistant right here, in the open street among many buildings, from where there were unknown how many people could be watching them. Noel replied with some doubt that no one had told him the exact place of the meeting, and it was far from certain that the man would come here. The young man had only been told that he would find him himself. Keynes agreed with his comrade, explaining that their assistant was from a family of mages. Noel pointed his hand in surprise at the silhouette of a man walking ahead, informing his friend that this was the man who had been sent to help them find the treacherous magician who had come to the royal family's banquet and dared to attack Lady Cecilia's life. Keynes immediately shifted his gaze to where his comrade was pointing. The young man's brown, blood-red eyes suddenly widened with intense surprise as he recognized the two men approaching them. It turned out that those who would be helping the boys in the investigation would be Lady Roe Chloe, daughter of the Marquis, and Arthur Robert, a young but very capable mage. This couple walked quite confidently straight towards the representatives of the Order, Noel, and Keynes. Arthur did not miss the chance to introduce himself first. The young man greeted the boys with a social smile and gave his name. His golden hair was bathed in sunlight, and his eyes glowed a bright green. Keynes immediately responded to Arthur's greeting with a firm handshake, and politely remarked that he was surprised that the heir to the Robert family had come to investigate the case in person. And then the young man named his position, assistant to the leader of the order. But then Keynes's dangerous, bloodshot eyes turned to the girl who was accompanying the mage of the Robert family. The young man stared at Lady Chloe. "Okay, Arthur, he is at least a man, but what is the young girl doing here?" He could not expect her presence here. Rather unceremoniously, he pointed his finger at Roe and asked Arthur what the young lady was doing here. Lady Chloe remained silent, coolly observing the boys' negotiations and not interfering for the time being. Roe explained to the order member that she had come here to find the culprit who had attempted to kill Lady Cecilia. The girl looked Keynes in the face with her green-brown eyes that burned through him every time. But even after Lady Chloe's answer, the young man still could not calm down. Why would she be searching for some magician who suddenly appeared at the banquet? In response, Roe did not dive into the details and told the guy that she just needed it. Then Keynes reminded the girl that she was Leston Chloe's sister, if her noble, saying nothing against the idea of Roe to participate in the search for the criminal. Apparently, the young man was ready to provide any argument, only to keep the girl out of the investigation. Roe replied that Lenstone did not care much about her affairs. Besides, Lady Chloe had informed Keynes that she was not a little girl in need of a guardian. She can decide where and why she wants to go without asking her older brother's permission. After such a rebuke, the assistant leader of the order was forced to retreat. Keynes rubbed the back of his head in confusion and complained that his brother and sister were so similar in temperament that he was sometimes afraid. However, Roe was not going to agree with Keynes that she and Leston were alike. She looked at the young man from beneath her scarlet bangs with an indignant and slightly offended look, making it clear that the topic was not worth pursuing in the future. At that moment, Noel intervened in their little tiff. The young man cautiously asked his companion if Roe was Sir Leston Chloe's own sister. The girl willingly, and without much embarrassment, confirmed the words of her possible fiancé. Keynes also did not understand what was the big deal. After the girl confirmed the kinship with Chloe, Noel could not refrain from pointing out to the girl that she and Leston were very similar. Keynes rashly rushed to agree with this, which caused another irritated look, and Roe wryly repeated that he and his brother are not alike. Arthur, listening to the conversation, realized that it was not leading to anything good and intervened firmly. The young man reminded those present that they were here to search for the criminal, not to talk, and he added that the first thing they should do was to get out of here to a quieter place. After a while, the whole company of detectives found themselves in a small, quiet cafe. It was a cozy place with large panoramic windows and indoor plants in tubs. At this time of day, it was almost empty and full of sunlight. Meanwhile, the conversation of the young men continued. Noel jumped up abruptly from his chair and turned to Arthur. He wondered if the cause of the incident with his sister was the jealousy of Arthur Roberts' admirers toward Cecilia. Because Arthur was getting rid of his groupies with Lady Cecilia's help, she could have been very seriously hurt. After calming down, Arthur sat back down and propped his chin with his hand and began to ponder why was it that Arthur was so rabidly popular with the girls. And the young mage ironically wondered if that was what he really cared about, rather than the fact that his sister might be hurt because of his popularity. Arthur and Noel continued to tease each other, the former as calm as ever, the latter flaring up, getting angry, and then calming down. Meanwhile, Roe and Keynes were having a leisurely conversation, not forgetting the coffee cups in front of them and the local cookies served with it. The young man moved a little closer to Roja and inclined his head toward her, clearly embarrassing the girl. While the others were busy joking around, Keynes said quietly, almost in his ear, to the slightly puzzled Roja that he had decided to figure out how the little mage was going to catch the culprit. The boy openly doubted the young mage girl's abilities. He straightened up, assuming his original position, and started his cup of coffee as if nothing had happened. The young marquise was not very pleased with this attitude of her potential groom. It seems that Keynes did not believe in her at all. In response to this distrust, Roe, without a drop of embarrassment, took a bite from a tasty chocolate cookie and loudly announced that her and Arthur's plan was for the girl to pretend to be the young magician's lover instead of Cecilia. Young Keynes was stunned at this turn of the conversation. He had never expected anything like this. Dozens of thoughts instantly flashed through his mind about how the girl's plan to catch the criminal might end. Keynes noticed that Noel was not far behind him in his amazement. To set himself up like that instead of Cecilia, Roe, Chloe, it's just something. Looking at this modest little girl, the boys could not believe that she had been involved in such a plan. Arthur Robert, seeing the strong reaction of both guys, embarrassedly lowered his eyes. He said guiltily that it was just the way it was. He was clearly letting the audience know that the idea of the hoax was not his. Roe, not paying any attention to the boy's negative reaction, nonchalantly continued her explanation. She said that according to her calculations, the criminal will be jealous of Arthur and will come for Lady Chloe. Then the girl will catch her. Keynes asked the girl doubtfully whether she was really sure of her abilities. The young man could see that he did not believe in the success of the plan of the magician Arthur Robert and the one to whom he was engaged, Roe Chloe. Roe didn't quite understand why the guy doubted that she could handle such a task. Keynes, however, replied that there could be doubts because the girl was engaged. Roe explained to her fiancé that no one knew about it since the engagement was unofficial. Keynes finally seemed to give up. But then Noel interrupted his furious altercation with Arthur, and with great surprise he asked Keynes, "What kind of engagement is this?" The boy was confused, and covering his face with his hand, tried to explain to his friend the situation of which he was unaware. Ro, still chewing her cookies, calmly answered for her new fiancé, telling Noel that she and Keynes were engaged. Unlike the young man, she didn't seem at all worried about it, and didn't care much about the other's opinions. Keynes, however, was not very enthusiastic about his fiancée's straightforwardness. He was not at all happy that their mutual acquaintances would soon learn of their engagement. Keynes sat in silence with a confused look, waiting for the reaction of his companions to the unexpected news. The boys, on the other hand, were more than a little confused. Noel was the first to ask since when they had been engaged. The girl replied that she had only recently found out. Arthur tried to congratulate the girl on this momentous occasion, but he was not very convincing. Then Keene became more serious, switching again to the subject of their today's meeting, the capture of the criminal. He turned to his so-called fiancée, noting that the unofficial engagement was a separate matter, but the main point was that the plan they had devised was very dangerous. The girl will be the bait for the magician who will try to kill her. Keynes also explained that although he understands Ro's desire to catch the criminal, he believes that it is too reckless to participate in this plan. And he, as the assistant leader of the order, is against it and as a fiancé is obliged to protect her. The girl's mind immediately flashed back to the day of the assassination attempt. How Arthur had covered her with his body, getting in the way of the glass mage. How Keynes had gotten hurt trying to quiet the attacker. His emotions in that situation. Ro slowly placed the rest of the chocolate chip cookie on the edge of the saucer next to the cup and thought, did Keynes really intend to protect her, take care of her, and in the future marry her and live happily ever after? But does she need all this for herself? Why does she need this imaginary care and security? Ro looked at the young man again with her unreadable green eyes and asked him defiantly if he was taking too much on himself by interfering in the girl's decisions. After all, it was only an unofficial contractual engagement. The young man did not avert his gaze as he usually did, but instead looked into Roa's eyes with insistence and seriousness. He explained that while she might feel as though Keynes was prying, it was a show of concern on his part, not an interference in her affairs. Lady Chloe stared at the young man with some bewilderment, trying to think how she should proceed. She doesn't need this care, protection, and kindness from Keynes. She's a mage, so she's much stronger, and she can handle everything herself without any help. Noel intervened, agreeing with his companion. Cecilia's brother explained that although the knights would be involved, it would not guarantee her safety, and the lad was greatly stressed that she would be in the most dangerous position. Arthur, protesting, pointed a finger upwards. "I'm on your side, but I'm also worried about you," said the golden-haired man's voice full of excitement. He looked unhappily at the girl sitting in front of him. The red-haired beauty looked at them emotionlessly, and after a couple moments of thought, she finally mumbled out, "If you all are so worried about me, then will you help me?" She looked sizing up all the men in the room. "Answer me, what should I do?" the girl continued. "So because of you I should suppress my desire and do as you tell me?" the girl asked, still looking at everyone's reactions with displeasure. The man with yellow eyes immediately stared at her guiltily. "That's right, we can't tell you what to do. There's not even anything to say," Noel said in a thoughtful voice. Rubbing his neck awkwardly, Keynes finally replied, "These mages are complicated creatures." "Well, I'll help you," the brunette continued. "Do as you see fit, but there's something you need to do in return." The girl looked skeptically at the guy who was giving her conditions in a disgruntled voice. He turned to the girl who was sitting to his left and looking straight into her eyes said, "Would you be kind enough to promise me one thing, Ro?" His cheekbones tensed and each word was several times considered. There was a loud clatter of carriage wheels, though they were traveling slowly, but the sound was quite distinct. Finally, the decisive day had come, said a red-haired girl sitting in the carriage next to a man with golden hair. The beautiful girl sat with her hands placed crosswise. "Will everything be decided today?" she asked in a quiet, uncertain voice, almost a whisper. "We must hope that the criminal will also come to tonight's ball." Arthur answered her. "Ro, do you remember what I told you about mages who don't learn to show their emotions?" The guy sitting across from her asked her in surprise. He was wearing a white suit, black tie, and a ribbon tied on his collar. With a barely perceptible nod, the girl replied, this time firmly looking with amber eyes directly at her interlocutor. You said they were dangerous because they have no humanity, she said emotionlessly. Such mages are capable of harming or killing another without hesitation, so do not try to solve everything yourself. We must act together. The golden-haired man spoke, looking at his companion. In a moment, his voice became a little more concerned. The most important thing is your safety. Tiredly leaning a hand on her head, the red-haired maiden replied, I get it. I've heard those words 100 times before, she exclaimed. The extraneous noise stopped. The girl looked out the window. We have arrived, sir. A servant's voice suddenly sounded. Ro was about to get up and get out of the carriage, but she was stopped by the man who, a moment ago, had almost jumped up while he was trying to reach her quickly. He put his arm around her neck, carefully placing the jewelry on. Wait, this is a present for you, said Arthur. Looking at her neck in surprise, the maiden asked, What is this? She gently touched the diamond-shaped pendant made of gemstones. It must be expensive, the girl thought, examining the choker. There was a black ribbon hanging tightly around her neck, and also hung a turquoise pendant with a trim of sparkling diamonds around the edges. The jewelry sparkled as it reflected the sunlight. It's a necklace with my magic. I think you'll need it, the man replied. I hope everything works out, Ro. The golden-haired guy continued, smiling brightly as he held out his white-gloved hand to her. His hair was perfectly styled and his eyes sparkled in anticipation of the celebration. The girl carefully, almost incredulously, put it into the palm of the smiling guy's hand. From the anticipation of such an event, the blood began to run in her veins. But there was nowhere to retreat to, and the girl certainly did not want that. Let's go. The girl looked expectantly at the boy's pale face. Does he ever stop smiling? Will he ever stop smiling? Ro thought tiredly. Let's go catch the glass mage, said the girl. Finally, they got out of the carriage. The red-haired girl was wearing a short-sleeved white and purple dress. The purple hem of the dress, fixed on the belt, covered only one leg, and the other was almost completely open. In the banquet hall was playing pleasant music. It now and then forced-to-dance guests arrived. Those in turn danced gracefully and without unnecessary movements. They twirled in a waltz, betraying the beautiful atmosphere of the evening. The gentlemen, dressed in fine clothes, enjoyed the ball. Each couple looked harmonious, giving a special beauty to the decorated hall, which in turn sparkled from such a wonderful atmosphere. The evening was wonderful. Noel looked at the aristocrats who were dancing, indulging in the beautiful music, with a sour face. He clearly did not like what was happening, and said aloud how much he disliked the situation. Everything at the ball was glittering with luxury, even Keen's, but not Noel. He tried to dress up, but he didn't do so well. He asked Keen's if the two of them had really come to the ball, to which he answered in the affirmative. Frowning, Noel asked Keen's why exactly he should be his partner, to which Keen's also frowned and replied that he wasn't too happy about it either. Suddenly, Keen's asked where Arthur and Lady Chloe were. Noel suggested that they must be over there. Pointing in the direction, he said that they should just walk over to the crowd of ladies. Walking up to the amazed crowd watching Arthur and Ro dancing, Noel said something about how Arthur and Ro fit together, to which Keen's, disbelieving, asked if he really thought so. Turning to Keen's, Noel worriedly said that it was proving to be a big problem. Just as worried, Keen's asked Noel if he thought the plan would work. Dancing Ro and Arthur were the center of attention. Leading Ro behind Arthur moved smoothly in the dance. What can't be said about Ro? Her movements were abrupt and lacked tact. Arthur smiled sweetly at Ro. It was obvious that he was relaxed. Ro, with her eyes wide open, was trying to fit in with Arthur. It was obvious that she knew nothing about dancing. Noel and Keen's, who were watching from the side, concluded that Ro was moving like a log. Looking at the dancing couple Ro and Arthur, Keen said that they didn't look like lovers. Noel, agreeing with him, said that it felt like they were forced to dance together. As the dance came to an end, Noel and Keen's approached them. Keen's apologized and said he would have to step in after all. Arthur and Ro turned to him. Turning to Ro, Keen said there was nothing he could do about her inability to dance. He asked what was wrong with her face, to which Ro asked incomprehensibly what was wrong with her face. Arthur held back tearfully from laughing out loud. Covering his mouth, he only chuckled. Ro asked him why he was laughing. With a cute grimace, Keen's told Ro that he was playing too badly after all. They were playing lovers, but you couldn't see it on her face. and that way they could be exposed faster. Carefully looking directly into Keynes's eyes, Roe asked him what kind of facial expression she should make then. Thinking of what to suggest to Roe, Keynes said that if she had to pretend to be in love, she should at least make an embarrassed or excited face. Listening to them, Noel said that it was too much to ask from Roe, to which Arthur agreed with Noel. Listening to them, Roe said that they said it was too much. Keynes thoughtfully asked if it was really too much. Keynes decided to start simple and told Roe to try smiling, showing on himself how he lifts the corners of his lips. Roe was perplexed and asked how to smile. After thinking for a moment, Keynes asked Roe to lift the corners of her lips. She did as he said. A cute smile appeared on Roe's face. It suited her very well. Trying to smile sincerely, Roe overdid it and was already shaking. She smiled awkwardly, looking at Keynes with her eyes bulging. Arthur, Noel, and Keynes were all laughing with their bellies clutching their stomachs. Keynes tried to say through his laughter that they weren't laughing at her, but he laughed again. They were laughing at her after all. Frowning, Roe said that it was her they were laughing at. She realized that no matter how much the guys denied it, it was true. Calming down a little, Keynes said they weren't laughing at her. She just had a funny look on her face. He asked her why she had volunteered to pretend in the first place. He added that it was better to leave it alone since it had already failed, but Roe assured him that she would definitely succeed. Roe gently took the unsuspecting Arthur by the collar. Rising up on her toes, Roe said that she had to show that she and Arthur were a couple by any means necessary. She decided to act boldly. Holding on to his collar, she moved closer to Arthur, leaving less and less distance between them. Roe closed her eyes and kissed Arthur gently on the cheek. The latter, in turn, opened his eyes wide in shock. They were so close that their hair was entwined with each other. Keynes was speechless when he saw the scene. Noel said it was better not to laugh at Roe anymore, and Keynes agreed with him. As if nothing special had happened, Roe asked if they had seen everything, saying it was the couple's behavior, not knowing what to say. Keynes just praised her. Arthur stood there in confusion. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Looking somewhere else, Keynes was horrified, his eyes bulging. The girl was staring emotionlessly at the crowd of aristocrats who were staring at her in bewilderment. Noel, Arthur, and Keynes were in confusion, not knowing what to do next. The awkward silence was interrupted by someone's voice. "Surely this way is normal," the golden-haired guy whispered to Roe. "This is something we didn't expect," and the brunette exclaimed. "So you'll become a target for the other ladies before you find the culprit." He looked at the red-haired lady in surprise, who only stared questioningly at the guests. "We need to concentrate," thought the lady. She began to look around the hall, studying people's reactions, trying to find unconventional ones. Then, the girl decided to check for people she already knew, such as those she had already seen at the last ball. "You see, there are ladies who spoke badly of Cecilia at the last ball," Rose said in a whisper to the men behind her. At the end of the hall stood 3 girls she knew well. They were heading as far away from the crowd as possible. The red-haired lady immediately followed them. "Should we follow them?" Barely audibly, reasoning, the girl said. "Wait, let's go together." The red-eyed brunette immediately rushed after her. The other guys remained in their seats. Turning around, the beauty said, addressing Keynes, "They'll see us faster this way. They're not dangerous at all. I'll just check the situation and come back." Turning around, she quickly followed the group of girls. A little behind the gossiping girls, the girl decided to eavesdrop a little on the voices coming from the different rooms. As she passed a room flooded with sunlight, she heard a ringing, caustic voice. "Did you see that? She's wearing a wig. It doesn't fit her at all." Roe carefully peeked behind the curtain that separated the space between the hall and the room. Laughing, the ladies continued, "Looks like she thinks she's a real aristocrat." Nodding, another girl answered her. "Dressed up, makeup, how vulgar." With a cold look, the red-haired lady thought. "Looks like they're grinding everyone's bones." The gossipers didn't stop talking for a second, each time coming up with new insults and reasons to hurt the other invited guests. "It's disgusting to see a bastard child pretending to be the guest of honor," said one of the gossip girls. "That's what I mean. She doesn't even know the basic rules of etiquette." Another one answered her, keeping the dialogue going. "They don't seem to be talking about me or Cecilia," the girl wondered. "Well, I kissed Arthur, so why isn't anyone discussing me?" the lady reasoned, slowly rubbing her chin. "Or am I really that bad?" thought she, standing behind the curtain, trusting that no one could see her. Suddenly someone walked by the girl. She didn't look like a gossip girl. I've never seen blondes around them, the red-haired lady thought, trying to remember why she seemed so familiar. That's right, it's the same girl, the girl realized. She recalled the events of the last ball. She hadn't forgotten how the girl, a blonde girl with dark purple eyes, had suddenly approached her. Lady Cecilia seemed to be very upset, the girl said, looking at Ro with a pleading look in her eyes. I don't know her well, so I think it would be best if you were the one to comfort her, she continued. Not understanding what she heard, the red-haired lady asked again, Comfort her? That's the same one who asked me to comfort Cecilia. The girl realized, ending her nostalgia. The violet-eyed blonde's face was tense, feeling that she was clearly unhappy with what was happening, but was holding back her anger. Why did she have such a gloomy face? Puzzled, the girl turned to the gossiping women. The women's laughter echoed from the walls. Are they still finding subjects to gossip about? The girl thought perplexedly. Suddenly a thought popped into Ro's mind. So, could it be that they are discussing her today? What should I do? I'll just pass by. I don't want any trouble, the red-haired girl thought, looking disdainfully at the trio of gossiping girls who stood in front of her, waiting for someone to make a mistake so they could discuss it later. Turning around, the girl took a quick step out from behind the curtain. She had nothing to do with the glass mage anyway, no need to get involved in unnecessary adventures. Coldly thought the red-haired lady. The girl mindlessly walked closer to the gossiping girls. The clinking of her purple, long heels echoed throughout the room, drowning out the conversations of the shameless trio. Listen. Loudly, drawing attention to herself, the girl said. The girls looked at Lady Ro in bewilderment. It is you, Lady Ro Chloe, the one who danced with Arthur, said the girl with her hair in a bun. Is something wrong with you, lady? Asked the red-haired beauty, another gossip girl. Watch your step, almost aggressively said the lady, looking at the three girls scornfully. What is this ridiculous situation? Suddenly a thought popped into my head. Why did I meddle in other people's business? Thought the girl, berating herself for such a stupid act.